G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and fresh from San Diego, California comes the only sunglasses brand that I'm ever going to wear again. I'm talking about Blender's Eyewear, and you're going to be just as hooked when you see how awesome these shades are. I got the Black Tundra Sunnies, and they're exactly what I was looking for. From a super comfortable fit to the strength of the shades, I couldn't be happier with what I received. They're perfect to wear when I'm out jogging or hiking because they have a really snug fit and they don't bounce around or fall off. They're also super lightweight and comfortable. In fact, the other day when I was out for a run, I nearly forgot that I had them on. Chase Fisher started Blenders by selling his beachy shades out of a backpack while doubling as a surf instructor on Pacific Beach. His goal? To create an adventurous, mid-priced eyewear option with the same cool factor as the other leading styles. Unlike expensive big brand shades that you've probably lost or smashed in the past, Blenders are actually really affordable, so you're not going to cry as much when the inevitable happens. Blender's team of in-house designers are constantly coming out with new styles, from orange polarized wraparounds, tortoiseshell frames with purple lenses, to classic gold arms on black lens. And it's not just sunglasses. Blenders has prescription glasses, readers, and blue lights, as well as a snow collection with goggles and accessories. Live life in forward motion with Blenders today. To score 15% off your Blenders purchase, visit blenderseyewear.com and enter promo code SCAREDVIP. That's blenderseyewear.com, code SCAREDVIP for 15% off. Blenders, rocked with pride worldwide. I used to frequent a relatively popular 11.5-mile hiking trail. The lot that this trail is on is only about 50 or so acres, so the trail winds back and forth in order to fit. So one day I was hiking. This particular day was very nice, the weather was good, and I hadn't seen a lot of people. At one point, about maybe 10 feet off the trail, I could see where I was going parallel to the same trail as it turned on and sort of snaked back about a mile ahead. I hope that makes sense, but I noticed that by that section of the trail, there was a fallen tree with 3 people sitting on it. A man, a woman, and a boy. This by itself wouldn't have been unusual, as it is one of the most popular trails in this area. The problem was, though, is that they were sitting, like, completely still and completely silent. Their backs were to me, and they seemed to be staring straight ahead, almost as if they were sort of, entranced or something. I was very unsettled, as this is obviously unusual behavior, so I kept walking, but being as unsettled as I was, I sort of looked back and was startled to find that they were gone. I stopped in my tracks, listening, but hearing nothing. I'll tell you why this startled me too, because any outdoorsman will tell you that sound travels in the woods. Sound becomes entrapped by the canopy and funneled through the trees. If somebody steps 100 feet away, you're likely to hear it, and I, having been raised in the woods, have ears attuned to such sounds. Yet those 3 people were able to move without me hearing, a thing. In the end, I just sort of dismissed it. Maybe my mind was preoccupied and I just hadn't heard them. So I turned back around to keep walking, and ahead of me now, on my section of the trail, there they were, with their backs to me again. I saw them silently walk away over a hill, and after that, I never saw them again. So now, not only had I failed to hear them, but I'd failed to see them walk past me, and I really don't know how. I immediately called my friend up, told him that the children of the corn were out at Swayback, and kept him on the phone so that he could send help if he heard me get hit by a pitchfork or something. There's a possibility, I admit, that I'm remembering details inaccurately, and what happened in reality might have been, much less uncanny, but this experience, it still bugs me to this day, and I'm almost certain that it happened the way I tell it. This all started when I was 14, when my mum met her new boyfriend. His name was Ray. I remember the first time that he met me and my siblings. He looked at my mum and said, "Oh wow, didn't know you had a gang," which, looking back on it, was a very weird thing for him to say, since he had been on a few dates with my mum before and she had told him exactly how many kids she had. Honestly though, Ray seemed like a normal guy at first. He was in his 40s and had 2 older sons from his last marriage who would sometimes come over for dinner, but things went wrong after he moved in. He would yell a lot and have a loud argument with my mum almost every day and throw things at her, but he would always sweet-talk his way around her afterwards, and this is probably why she didn't leave him sooner. My mum was crazy young when she had us, and she has always been a bit immature for her age, so I think that it made it easier for him. But Ray found it difficult to get along with my siblings and me. He would complain about every little thing that we did wrong and quickly became very controlling. But whenever we complained about how he was acting to our mum, he would accuse us of trying to ruin their relationship. This would work pretty much every time too, since it would cause her to get angry and yell at us instead of him. As we got older, he stopped us from seeing friends that he didn't like and wouldn't allow any friends to come over unless they had his approval first. I realized that he was crazy when he picked me up from school one day, which he never did, and while driving home, he accused my sister and me of trash-talking him behind his back. When I asked him how he would even know that, he told me that he had proof. When we got home, he showed me a tape recorder and played back a recording of my sister and me complaining about him in our bedroom at night. I asked him why the heck he put recorders in our bedroom for, and we had a huge argument over this. But I immediately called my mum and told her. I later found out from her that she never actually said anything about it to him. I made him remove all the tape recorders from our bedroom, but I'm convinced that he kept on hiding them since he would sometimes bring up conversations that my sister and I had while he wasn't around. We were so paranoid that we would whisper and we would never talk about anything private in case he somehow heard it. We were so terrified that he also had cameras as well as tape recorders, and we would dress and undress super quickly so if there were any cameras that he wouldn't be able to see anything. And it really makes me angry thinking about the fear that we lived in while living there. When I was 16, I got a job at a fast food place, and Ray had a big problem with that as well. His reasoning for this was that my boyfriend at the time worked there, and he believed that I was just going there to mess around with my boyfriend. So his way of checking on me was to come and sit in the parking lot and record me. He did this too for a complete month. He would show me the recordings after which and would just lead to even more arguments, ending with 16-year-old me begging a 40-plus man to not stalk me at work. I was pretty much done at this point and moved in with my dad, who had just moved back from New Zealand. My dad was so angry when I told him about everything that had happened, and he wanted to call the cops on Ray, but my mum begged him not to. They broke up a few years later after something unrelated, but thankfully, I never saw him again after this. My earliest encounter occurred around 3 or 5 years ago. I had decided to stay with my aunt. Her house was big with 3 baths and various rooms. I was on the 2nd floor alone when everything happened. So, I was working on a video when my youthful step-aunt appeared. I followed her into her room, excited to show her what I had done with my phone. My younger cousin was also in her arms. Both of them are female. She wasn't in the room when I walked in, but I turned behind the door thinking that she was playing a joke on me. But when I did, nobody was present. I quickly dashed downstairs to find her, but she claimed that she had not gone upstairs at all. It was a really weird experience, so I just stayed downstairs. I had my next incident around 2 or 3 years ago. I'm upstairs in a house by myself once more. My family's home wasn't very large, but my elder sister then arrived, bearing our little sister. I was too lazy to go and fetch something, so I called her from across the room. She walked up to the mirror and remained there still, without responding to me before exiting the room. I thought that was weird, so I followed her out of the room as she went at a slow pace. When she turned a corner, though, and then I did afterwards, she was nowhere to be found. I dashed downstairs once again, where my elder sister was showering. My younger sister was downstairs too, playing with her toys. I was really creeped out once again, and I stayed downstairs. There were numerous parallels between these two situations that made them seem like falsehoods and fables, I guess, but I was alone upstairs in a house that belonged to a relative. The people that came upstairs were all women, and one of them was holding a female toddler. Both rooms had a bed with a mirror pointing straight into the direction of the bed, and both of them happened in the afternoon. I'm still freaked out by the whole thing. I don't know what to think about it, but what do you guys think it all means? I would really love to get some help with this because I have no idea what to do next. So when I was 16, I was on my Duke of Edinburgh Silver Award expedition. It's sort of a citizenship thing for like teens and young adults. Comes in gold, silver and bronze levels and involves going on an expedition in a group of 4 to 7. We were hiking and planning to cover about, I think, 60 kilometers in 3 days to meet the requirements. You have to avoid roads as much as possible and navigate by map and compass, carrying literally everything that you need. Anyways, day 2 of the hike, and we've been going most of the day. We're heading down what we think is a bridle path towards a road which we need to walk along for 100 meters or so to link up with another footpath so that we can keep going across the country. We get to a pond that isn't marked out on a map, but no problem, it's borderline for the size that you'd expect to see marked. Then, as we go a bit further, we realize that there's a cross ahead with 2 paths meeting, and the second path definitely should be marked, but isn't. Much debate begins, and we've been standing there for about 5 minutes going over the map, trying to figure out where we are, when we hear an engine coming closer. This was weird too, given that you're not really supposed to drive on bridle paths, but we see a little van. It's coming towards us and move back off the path because it's hard to tell someone off for driving on a bridle path after they've run you over, right? The van goes past us a little, then stops, then reverses. A middle-aged bloke leans out and asks if we're okay. We say yes, but ask if he can tell us the way to the road. We figured that even if we've taken the wrong path, roads are far enough between that it should still be the right road and we can sort of reorientate ourselves from there and get back on the track. But then it gets weird. You see, he points to the path that we came down. Yeah, you can just go down there past the pond. It's about 10 minutes. Tell you what, why don't I give you a lift? We say no to this. It's not allowed, but he gets out and opens the back of the van. It's carpeted and has what looks like a camera and light equipment, which he starts moving about telling us to get in. We refuse again, explaining that we'd be breaking the rules. Besides, even if the slip and telling us to go the way that he didn't know we came from hadn't weirded us out enough, the equipment definitely did. Eventually he gives up and closes the van, gets in the front and leaves. By going down the branch that we came from, that is. The one that he told us that would lead to the road, but we knew that it didn't. Which was not the branch that he'd been about to go down before he reversed to speak to us. As soon as he was out of sight, it took us about 5 nanoseconds to decide that we definitely were not going either of the ways that he'd seemed interested in going down, thank you. We decided to go down the branch that he'd come from, reasoning that he couldn't have been running back around back paths forever, and if he did come back looking for us, he might be less likely to look the way that he came from. And we reached the road in less than 10 minutes. It was the single creepiest experience of my teen years. In the end, too, we literally walked along the road behind a hedgerow, so we'd be harder to see from the road for like a mile until we found a phone box, called our expedition leader, and got him to pick us up. We heard engines 2 or 3 times and dropped to the ground behind the hedgerow every time, scared that it was this guy looking for us. I think all of us ended up in tears in the back of the minibus once the adrenaline wore off. Anyway, I'm just thankful that we made it out of there, all in one piece. So I work as an assistant in nursing. I work night shifts through an agency, meaning that I work at all kinds of facilities and places, not just at one place. I've experienced multiple weird and scary things so far, but one in specific stuck out to me. I was at an aged care facility, a nursing home, upstairs down a corridor with another AIN, an RN as well, and 2 residents. They had just had a fight as one had dementia and tried to go into the other's room at a bit past 3 in the morning or something. For reference too, we were standing about maybe 2/3 down the hallway, which was fairly well lit until halfway down, so the corridors aren't too bright. We have enough light on so that we can see everything to the end clearly, but not enough to disturb people. At the end of the hallway are 2 rooms opposite each other, the one on the right being empty as the previous resident had passed away about a few months ago. As the 3 of us are trying to defuse the situation and get them into their rooms, I'm standing with my back to the wall, standing between the residents, while the other 2 talk to the residents about the situation. And all of a sudden, I get this weird feeling like something just isn't quite right. Looking back on it, I realize that it felt like I was being watched from somewhere down the end of the corridor, sort of an instinctive feeling, I guess. So I sort of look over, and that was when I see it. A brief flash of movement. What I saw was a black shadow figure run from left to right, but between the 2 rooms at the end of the corridor. No color, not transparent, and definitely not a person. Although it was sort of the shape of a tall man, I guess, but I only saw it for a second though, because as soon as it entered the darkness again of the room, it disappeared. I felt my whole body go numb though. I'd had weird experiences that I couldn't explain before, but never anything like that. We finished dealing with the situation and got them both back to bed, and went to sit down in the nurse's station. Once the RN left, I spoke to my co-worker, a lady that I've worked with plenty of times before, and we have a sort of mutual trust and understanding. She also has a very confident demeanor, and so after a while what I started to realize what it was that I could have been looking at, and I was getting increasingly disturbed. We eventually got to the topic of creepy things that we've experienced in night shifts, and were talking about our stories, hearing things that we can't explain, buzzers going off for empty rooms, things being moved or buzzers being turned off, stuff like that, when the residents in the rooms most definitely can't do it themselves. And after a bit, I explained what I saw earlier in the night to her, and she just stops, looks at me with a really serious face, and tells me to again describe the figure as best as I can. A tall shadow figure, no distinct features, shape of a tall man. Her smile fades quickly, and she paused for a minute, taking in a deep breath before explaining that I'm not the first to see him, apparently. A few of the night staff in that wing, they had seen him too, including herself, and they think that it's the resident who died in that end room, as he fits the description. This resident also was incredibly protective over one of the ladies down the hall a bit, as they think that he was in love with her, and she was quite gentle and frail. She told me of the time that she went to check on this lady after her buzzer went off, but as she walked in, it had already been turned off. This was for a resident who was almost entirely immobile now, and couldn't reach the off button herself. As she walked in, a bit back from the foot of the bed, was that same shadow figure, standing facing the door, waiting for her to come in, and just sort of watched her. She checked the resident, looked okay, and after that, ran out of the room. Whatever it was, it barely moved, but it turned slightly as to keep watching her almost at all times. She got a co-worker to check the room, and when they did, nothing was there when they both went back. We then decided to go and check the end room that it ran to earlier, and nothing. The only thing out of the ordinary was the wardrobe doors were wide open, as well as the bathroom door too, both with the lock somehow still engaged and working. I should also mention too that these are normally kept locked when the room is vacant, to stop wandering residents from going in and hiding or getting lost and whatnot. But what we did notice was the room felt abnormally cold and had a very dark feeling about it. I've been back to work there several times since then, and that room is still empty and still has that same feeling in it. I've heard some strange things down there too, but nothing that you couldn't make up a decent explanation for, I guess. All in all, it's a really great place to work, I'll admit, but I will never go down there alone again. We're also pretty sure that he stays around to watch over her and protect her like he did before he passed, but I just cannot get over the overwhelming darkness that you can literally feel in that room. So, I just moved into a new house, guys, and I'll be honest, I'm really scared. I've been living here for about a month now. It's newly constructed, a couple of years. The first couple of weeks, too, I felt really good. It felt so bright and cheery. Everything felt great. I got great vibes from everything about it. It felt like I'd made a great decision. Also, just to quickly preface this, I do have a carbon monoxide detector. I put it on the first night. So, my first couple of nights sleeping here, it already started. I would have auditory hallucinations right before falling asleep, which I've never really had before. I would hear a whisper in my ear. The first one was, "Hello, how are you?" and I quickly snapped awake. Then it's been the sounds of yelling and people bustling around me, etc., but I quickly snap up, and when I do, nobody's there. I quickly started having vivid nightmares every night as well. I don't usually have vivid dreams and haven't had nightmares in like forever. It would be things like seeing the inside of my body, and my heart was like infested with larvae. They were sort of squirming in and out of me, and I'd see my house swarming with infestations. I'd be hurt, tortured, killed. My insides were always usually had something going wrong with them. But I shrugged this all off as it is just dreams, admittedly, even though it is a bit scary. But on the third week, everything quickly went downhill. I decided to do a full tank change on my axolotl tank. It falls and crushes my fingers and leg. Then I discover a large ant infestation in the tank below it. They were so disgusting. They left like a black gooey grime everywhere that they were, festering in the corners, crawling over one another, and it made me really retch and gag. I quickly went out, vacuumed, sprayed, and really cleaned everything up as best as I could, and placed traps. I was done with the tank change when I noticed all of the poison ants start running to the inside of the tank below, drowning and sort of killing themselves in it. I emergency move the fish into another tank, and a pregnant black widow crawls up from the side. I spray her down and move her out. Then a mystery hole appears in the drywall. Spiders crawl out, crawl on the ceiling, and jump onto me from the ceiling while I'm in bed. I have a high loft bed. The pest people have no clue what made the hole, but it just keeps getting bigger as well. They find no termites or any cause for it. But then I notice the fish shelf is breaking. I go out to buy a new shelf, and Lowe's catches on fire while I'm in it. I leave and go wherever else I can to find a new shelf, get one and move my tanks onto it, when all the glass on the tank breaks and they all fall. This new tank, less than a year old and a good brand, just suddenly burst. I put them in a bucket and buy them a new tank. I clean and add a new filter, new heater, feed them good night. I wake up and all of their skin is now falling off, and they're half dead. I emergency change the water, and it's no good. Then my cat gets cat fleas, and I don't know where and how. He starts to retch and vomit and peeing blood. Half of my electrical appliances met their end in these few days. I threw away so many things that it pains me, in fact. Like things for my fish, extension cords, vacuums, my hair curler fizzled and burned. The heater on the tank stopped heating and instead sent electrical shocks everywhere. Mind you, this all happened in the last few days after the hello and the dreams. You could say it's just bad luck and bugs, I know, but I don't know, it just seems like too much at once for me, and it just doesn't feel right. My dreams, maybe they tried to warn me, and this whole time there is some sort of rhythmic tapping in the ceiling too. No scurrying, AC heaters off, no water damage or anything, but it knocks every hour or so. Sometimes it's short knocking, sometimes it's long, it's not consistent. It's always from the same spot though. Sometimes there's a bang too, but that one happened in different spots, usually above my head. Sometimes I hear knocking at the door, and when I go to answer, there's nobody there. I also keep, seeing stuff out of the corner of my eyes. No figure, just like a shadow or a light moving across the room. It also feels like large bugs are crawling under my skin sometimes that I'm in the house, and it burns, like I'm on fire almost. Although this could be because I'm on such high alert. I don't know. I am really scared, so it could be anxiety, I know that. Anyway, this all happens in a few days, and I left and went to stay at my dad's for a few days because I just couldn't take it anymore. And I felt really good there. But as soon as I came back and stepped foot inside this house, I just feel so much dread. I feel so much better as soon as I step outside, but one step inside and my stomach suddenly drops. What happened to the good vibes the first couple of weeks? It feels so dark and like I'm trapped in here. It used to feel so light and free, but the horrors and the problems, they just never seem to end now. The pest people sprayed after I found the ants, but they found no large issues. They sprayed anyways because I needed it for peace, I guess, but the spiders, they keep coming back and they still haunt me. The hole is still there. The whispers, the dreams, the death of my fish. I love them so much, and they find nothing in the attic. I make sure they check it many times, but why does the tapping not end? These days, I sleep with all the lights on in this dreaded house to the sound of that tapping, and it just won't stop. I've noticed that it's most often in bouts of 9s and 7s, and it keeps getting louder as well, I swear. I need help, guys. I don't know what I'm dealing with. I don't know what to do. Please, help me. So I moved into a new house about 18 months ago. My special needs cousin and my brother live with me. 3 weeks ago, my brother woke up in the middle of the night and decided to sit outside and have a cigarette. He said that he heard the gate open and looked up, and the landlord's boyfriend, they live next door, was sneaking into the yard apparently. My brother yelled at him and he tried to act like he wasn't there. My brother got up and the guy ran back to his house. But if this wasn't strange enough, he's been caught 4 times this week putting his hand through the window and moving the blinds so that he can watch us. I caught him personally a few nights ago standing on a box to peek into my bedroom. I put dead leaves under our window so that we can hear him, and it worked. We caught him sneaking behind our house at about 1 a.m. The next morning at 7 a.m. I got a call from the landlord telling me to remove the leaves. They can't see them from their house. You have to be behind my house to see them at all. It's kind of scary, and I've been sleeping with my gun and my dog at this point. I feel like if I do anything about this, that I'll end up on the streets. It's almost impossible to find another rental where I live at the moment. To be honest, I'm really not sure what to do. We're moving out of this place tomorrow, I think. But I think we're about to move out of this place tomorrow because I left the house for 20 minutes today and somebody had definitely broken in. As of right now, I feel like I have only 2 choices. Shoot the man or leave in the morning. I'm purchasing an RV tomorrow so that I have somewhere to stay temporarily. I have a little bit of money saved and my boss is helping with the rest. All I can say is that I'm thankful for the people in my life's help. After I get all my stuff out, I'm going to talk to the police and the property manager. Hopefully she won't help them rent this to anyone else. I doubt the police will do much though, since, well, I don't really have much proof, but anyways, here's to moving on. This happened a few years ago when I was working at a hospital. I was taking my lunch break and wanted to have some alone time in my car. I was an assistant who sat at the front desk all day, so I needed time to myself for relaxing. And after getting lunch in our cafeteria, I start walking outside to go to my car. I walk out one of the main entrances that's across from our behavioral health facility. I see this lady who I assume was a patient, as she was in green scrubs and was holding a brown paper sack and just sort of standing around the entrance. She didn't look like medical staff and had blood on her scrubs as well. I also made the assumption that she may have been discharged from behavioral health or something. Anyway, as I walked past her, she shouts at me, "Hey ma'am, can I get a ride?" And I stopped to look at her and shook my head, said no sorry. I felt guilty as she probably didn't have anyone to call herself, but she quickly replied, very offended, "Why?" Which, that to me meant that it wasn't a good idea to engage, and she probably would have been really angry at any excuse that I gave her. So I turned away and I just kept walking to my car. Once I get into my car, I lock the doors and turn it on to listen to some music. As soon as I start to eat my food, the lady in the green scrubs appears at my driver's side door and is yelling at me and knocking on the window. I don't know what she's saying, as I'm pretty startled and looking at her in disbelief. The parking lot that I was in was pretty huge, as this held most of the staff who worked at the hospital, so I was pretty shocked to know that she had been following me the whole time without me noticing. And it's also really weird that she felt the need to follow me without shouting more at me or to get my attention or anything. I was too stunned to say anything to her, but she suddenly went to the back passenger door and tried to open it. I see that she can't actually open the door because I locked them when I got inside. But seeing this, I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I was shaking. I had no idea what this lady was capable of or if she was going to leave at all. But the fact that she was trying to open my car door to force me to give her a ride? I don't know what I would have done if she actually got in there, but I think my fight or flight mode would have kicked in and I would have had to physically remove her myself if I felt threatened. In any case, as soon as dispatch answers my phone call, the lady was slowly walking away from my car, and then I didn't see her at all. Now, our hospital has its own sort of like police department, so when I told dispatch where I was, she transferred me to the hospital PD. I tell them what happened, what the lady looked like, what parking lot I was in, and they asked if I felt safe to walk back to work and that an officer would escort me, but I declined. I kind of felt silly for feeling that afraid, and I didn't want to seem weak by needing the police to walk me back. I wait in the car for a few minutes and see our PD circling the lot a few times. I assumed that she was never found because I didn't see where she walked off to, and I never saw police stopped anywhere talking to anyone that may have been the lady or anything. I was shaking during my whole lunch break and didn't feel like eating anymore. Nothing like that had happened to me before, and I'm always paranoid when a stranger walks up to me and asks for like help or money or anything. I always want to help, but my gut always tells me that it's just never really a good idea. I could have told her that there were phones inside the hospital she could use to call someone for a ride, I suppose, but knowing what happened later, that probably wouldn't have helped. And I had seen that she was talking to other people outside before I walked past her at the entrance, so she had been asking many people, I assume. I feel bad, as she probably has some sort of mental health issues or something, but I know it doesn't excuse her behavior. I didn't tell anyone when I got back to work either. I just wanted to move on with my day like it never happened. I didn't want anyone to make a fuss over it. Thankfully, nothing else has happened like that again, and I always walk with purpose when I'm leaving or going to my car these days, and having pepper spray helps a little too. I'm really glad that I have the habit of immediately locking my doors once I'm inside my car though, because honestly, who knows what could have happened if I hadn't have locked the doors that day. So I'm female, 31, states away from house on a business trip. About an hour ago, around 8:30 p.m. here, I had just gotten back to my room from a work dinner, and I heard shuffling in the hallway, peeked out the peephole. I saw a figure seemingly outside the room to the left of mine, looking outwards. They were knocking lightly and said twice, quickly, "Hello." Then it sounded like the door opened and closed. I was like, okay, they must have forgotten what room they were in or something, and someone let them in. I walk back to the main part of my room, and I hear shuffling again. I look out and see a figure. Can't really make out what the person looks like, but I see them on the other side of my room this time, and again I hear light knocking and hello. Now, I'm starting to get a weird spidery sense of like, what the heck is going on? I see the figure leave and think, okay, that was weird. Then I again start hearing shuffling. I start walking toward the hotel room door and hear a light knock on what sounds to be my door, I think. And again I hear, hello, hello. And immediately after this, someone attempts to open my door. Thank God I had the cross latch pulled over, not the deadbolt though. My heart stopped as I stood there and watched the door hit the latch and fall back shut. I called the front desk and informed them that someone had just tried entering my room and I'm not staying with anyone. The front desk attendant just replied, "I don't have any housekeeping up there." To which I replied, "Okay, well that's concerning. Can you please send someone up to check around?" The attendant replied that there was no manager on duty, to which I asked if I could call the police instead because I was very worried, as I started to cry a bit. She replied that I should do what I thought I needed to do, and I hung up and cried for a bit, not sure what to do. I didn't want to ask for another room because I was too scared to leave now. But 10 minutes later, the hotel phone starts ringing. I was honestly feeling really scared to answer, but I did. It was the front desk attendant, and she said the police were going to be coming to my room, and she didn't want me to panic when I heard someone knock on the door. I said okay, and I hung up. I sat there and thought, how do I know that this is actually legit? Whoever tried to access my room had a key, otherwise, how else would the door have actually opened? A few minutes later, as expected, I hear a knock. I looked out the peephole and saw 2 male officers. I didn't ask to see ID, which, in hindsight, it probably would have been the smart thing to do, but I was so shaken up and not really thinking straight. I opened the door and they asked what was going on, and so I told them all that I explained earlier. They said it was good that I had the cross latch pulled over because the door would have opened if not, and I responded that it's a hotel. What do you mean? What's the point of the access card then? And wiggled the handle. We were in the hallway talking with my door open. Then they took a pause and they were like, "Oh, it automatically locks?" Again, I'm like, yeah, it's a hotel. So then they had me shut the door and open it with a key to test it. Sure enough, it didn't open without the access card. Then they said it was probably housekeeping. I responded that the front desk attendant told me that there was no housekeeping up here when I called. Plus, it was like 8:30 p.m. Why would housekeeping be coming by that time unless I'd requested someone to come by? Plus, I noticed housekeeping had already been by during the day because my trash was emptied and the dirty towel was gone. They ultimately told me that they thought that it was housekeeping and not to worry, but if anything else happened or I felt unsafe, then I should call them. They also said that if I wanted to change rooms, that they were sure the hotel would accommodate this. I said okay while crying, and they left. And now I'm sitting in my room crying, laying under the covers in my clothes. I'm sure that I won't be sleeping tonight. I'm also too afraid to change rooms because I don't want to leave this room now. I have the cross latch pulled over and the deadbolt locked. I think that I'm safe. Am I being paranoid? I don't know. Was it housekeeping? Should I do something different? I don't know what that was, but all I know is that I can't wait for this to be over. So there was a house in my hometown that I've always been fascinated with since I was a young child. It was on a main road, and whenever I rode by it, I would try to imagine what it was like living in that house, and I had a clear picture in my mind of what it was like inside. In late 2019, my husband and I were on our way to visit my sister, and along the way we see that house that I loved from my childhood was listed for sale. We were renting and happy, but something told me that we should buy that house. I looked it up on Redfin and calculated that the mortgage would actually cost less than our rent, and it was recently renovated, so there shouldn't be many upfront costs. We found a realtor, toured the house, put an offer in, and it was accepted in 24 hours. Our offer was accepted in March of 2020, right before the housing market exploded and property values went through the roof. The seller was very eager to work with us and correct every single thing that came up in the inspection, and even corrected some things that we didn't ask for. In fact, she went way above and beyond to make sure that we didn't back out. In any case, we moved in and we quickly discover that the house is really, haunted. Never anything sinister, but something in the house definitely wants us to know that it's there and it likes things a certain way. The details could be an entirely different post, but 2 previous homeowners have confirmed that they've experienced paranormal activity there too. A person who lived in the house in the 90s actually stopped by to talk about it when he was in town visiting. The thing that concerns me is that these folks have experienced things that were much more sinister than we have. I think the creepy details here are that the house's layout and style are exactly as I envisioned them as a kid too. It sounds silly, I know, but I used to draw the layout in the sand when I played house as a little kid, and I even tried to recreate the house in The Sims when I was in high school. The other creepy thing, though, is, the dreams. You see, as we were closing, my husband and I had some insanely vivid dreams about the house and its occupants. Again, nothing sinister or scary, I guess, but definitely weird. Notable history of the house, too, is that it was built by a local mason in 1928 as a retirement cottage for him and his wife. It was their dream home, and the descendants of his family are still in the area and have asked to come over and see it. They have a real attachment to the house, too. Apparently, somebody ended their own life in there in 2002. The second night that we slept in the house, a blade from the ceiling fan in our bedroom became detached and flew across the room. The fan is apparently mounted where the light fixture that this man ended his own life with was located. There were reports of paranormal activity before this, and this man had a gambling problem, I believe. They got a foreclosure notice, and his wife filed for divorce in the month before, everything went down, so I really don't believe that it was related to the paranormal activity, but who knows. I guess what I'm wondering, though, is why do I have such a connection to this house? And how likely is whatever is here to be as benign as it appears to my husband and me? I still love this house and have no desires to leave, but I also am aware that a ceiling fan blade flying across the room like that and almost hitting one of us is not your average haunting. When I was about 4 or 5, I was at my grandmother's home, several stories from there, and it was a rainy spring day. I remember playing in the living room since I couldn't go out, but the front door was open, but the screen glass exterior door was closed still. At some point, I noticed an old man dressed in a black suit, a white shirt, large brim black hat, standing at the end of the walk facing the door, about 30 feet out. I remember he seemed sort of out of place at the time, and it sort of struck me, even at a young age, as being sort of, disturbing, I guess. I ran to get my grandma because everything about it scared me, and she sensed the terror and ran back to the front door area with me. When I looked back down the end of the walk, the man was nowhere to be seen. But chills ran down my spine as my grandmother placed a hand on my shoulder, proceeded to back up slowly and started yelling, "You get out of here." When I looked up at her, she had a glare in her eyes, locked on the door, and repeatedly yelled, "Get out of here," while pulling me back. I then looked at the upper half of the door where she was pointing and saw the old man standing what would have been inches from the glass portion upper half of the door, but I had just been inches from the lower half screen and saw nothing. He only appeared in the upper half of the door, if that makes sense, and my grandmother backed us up to the hallway, and when we got there, she turned quickly and darted us off to the kitchen. I remember this so clearly too. There were many other experiences in that home, but that one definitely stands out and has stuck with me my entire life. This happened when I was like 4 or 5, a few days or weeks after Easter. You see, that year I had eaten an awful lot of chocolate, and ultimately, well, I was pretty blocked up. This led to me being kind of disgusted by it, I suppose, to the point that I had officially declared that I hated chocolate. And this, believe it or not, was actually what saved my life, I think. That day, my parents and I were walking down the avenue, and I asked my parents if I could run, and they said yes. A man who probably thought that I was alone decided to approach me. I don't know how accurate my memories are, but I definitely recall him being extremely close to my face. He offered me a chocolate bar with the creepiest grin ever, and I politely declined and argued that I didn't like chocolate anymore. I remember being really calm and not really scared much. I was just a toddler, so I don't think I realized what was happening. My parents immediately intervened, though, and scared this guy away. They told me that I'd done a great job refusing that man's offer because, well, maybe he could have poisoned it, or worse. And I think this is what really scared me at the time. I still love chocolate these days, but I thank God almost every day that back then I didn't. When I was a child, about maybe 6 to 7 at my best guess, I lived in a haunted house. The owner's mother apparently died there, and there are rumors that it was used as a drug den before the owner started renting it out. Anyhow, I used to see a gown float by the doorway, and I would also have very, demonic dreams, for a lack of a better term. 2 incidents stand out as potentially demonic to me anyway. Once, when I was lying down to sleep, I heard a commanding deep voice say, "There's somebody in the house." That's it. No follow-up, and nothing else. I've never had another incident like that in my entire life, but the second incident was one night when I woke up out of a deep sleep and saw a face on the ceiling. I drew it for my mother, and she had me checked out. I was fine. So she instead had the house blessed, and after that we never had an issue since. Fast forward about 2.5 years ago, when my first daughter was about to be born. For about 2 months, I had a reoccurring nightmare where a tall man in a black hat, sort of like a top hat, but sort of misshapen too, would stand at the foot of the bed and just sort of watch me. Upon waking, I would have sleep paralysis for a few seconds, and in those moments, I could still see and feel him. My wife would often wake me up claiming that I was screaming, "No, who are you?" or other times just mumbling. But after my daughter was born, I only had one other incident. I was rocking her back to sleep in her crib, and I saw my wife open the door a crack and stand by it, looking in. I asked her to come in, but for some reason she didn't move. I said, "Babe," and nothing. At the same time, I went to the door to open it all the way. I heard her groggy voice from the adjacent bedroom, our room, say, "Huh? What?" I'll never forget it. Exactly how it sounded and everything. As the door opened, I had a flash of just white void where a face would be, along with the rest of what I can only describe as a figure exactly as tall as I am, I guess. It vanished in a moment, and I ran to my bedroom and sat in bed with my daughter. Every single hair on my arms and neck stood straight up that night, and I've never felt anything so terrifying since then. Now, everything has been fine since that event for years, and here and there random things will happen, I guess. Nothing that can't be explained. Like, I had a buddy stay at my house one night when my wife and daughter were with her sister visiting her grandfather, and he said that he was awoken in the early morning by 2 male voices discussing something. He asked if I had somebody come to the door in the middle of the night, and I hadn't. But other than that, there's really nothing out there. That said, though, in our most recent home, about 3 months ago, my daughter began experiencing night terrors too. I had them as a kid, and they're truly heartbreaking. The only thing that I can do is hold her arms and head still so she doesn't hurt herself. She'll scream at me, growl, hit me, throw herself around, the whole works. Everything that I've read said that they don't remember from the next day, and they're asleep for the whole thing. It's really heartbreaking though, but it makes me feel better knowing that she doesn't really remember the incidences. Anyway, around the same time this started, things started moving around in the house. What I mean is that we'll hear cabinets open and shut, hear something thump or bang, and I've even seen shadow figures hiding around walls as I walk past. One night, while reading to her, she and I both witnessed a sock move itself across her bedroom floor. I know she saw it too because when I walked her by the spot on the floor to get her out of the room, she stopped and looked down at it, clearly puzzled. I tried to play it off to her, and my wife and I chalked it up to air currents, but there's just no way that that was an air current. After this, though, I saged the home immediately, and I've been trying to keep everyone's minds off of it. But it's getting worse. My daughter is waking up in the middle of the night screaming no or mine. Sometimes she seems like she's having a conversation with someone, but when we go to investigate, obviously nothing is there and she's fast asleep. Last night, too, I had something happen on the baby monitor that I just couldn't explain. I took some photos of it, but unfortunately I really don't have a way of sharing them here. But in a nutshell, for about 30 seconds, I could see a really large shadowy head behind my daughter's own head on the monitor. I took a photo of it on my phone to send to my buddy to see what he thought. My wife was asleep at this point with our 4-month-old. When I checked the monitor again, though, it was gone. To me, it was clear as day, and although he says that he sees it, he does think that it could just be a shadow. Anyhow, I'm pretty much at my wit's end now. I'm terrified that I've harbored something all these years from my own childhood, and now it's planning to torment my daughter. Does anyone have any experience with this, or any advice? Anything at all at this point, I'll take it. I thought the saging would help, but I don't know, it almost seemed to tick it off even more, and maybe it's made things even worse. I was 14 at the time of this incident. I was home with my brother, grandma, and my baby cousin. My brother had invited some girl over. Please remember that part too, because it is key to this story. My brother then introduced us to the girl. She looked normal, but seemed a bit, I don't know, maybe nervous or something. My grandma asked her some questions and told her that if her and my brother needed anything, to let her know. Anyways, my grandma told me to stay upstairs and allow my brother and the girl privacy downstairs. Of course, me being the nosy little sister, I wanted to know everything, especially this new girl that my brother brought home. I sort of snuck down the hall quietly and looked over the banister. I saw the girl looking outside the backyard and also asking my brother questions like, who all live here? Is this your guys' house? It's so nice. Hearing the conversation, I decided to listen to my grandma and go back inside my room. I began to listen to music and felt the urge to look outside my window. I then saw a 2000 Chevrolet Impala parked outside of our driveway. The door was wide open and it appeared to be a man leaving our home with all of our tech items from our home and packing it inside the car. A feeling of dread came over me like, yo, what is going on? Then the sound of loud talking was heard downstairs and my brother said, please, you don't have to do this. Just let us leave if you know what's best for you, the girl responded. I hurried and ran to my grandma as quietly as I could to let her know what I saw downstairs and what I heard. She didn't understand the severity of what I was telling her and began to laugh, which kind of made me upset because, our life could have been in danger, right? I heard tires screech and saw the Chevrolet Impala speed down the street. I called out to my brother and he said, in a really distraught voice, what's going on and who was that man outside? I asked. He didn't reply. I walked downstairs and saw my brother shaking his head in disbelief, looking at where our TV used to be. The police came shortly due to my grandma calling them. We were later informed that my brother and the girl met for the first time that day, off of a dating app of all things. And of course, they met at our home. The girl, of course, set up the entire robbery. She was just the decoy until her boyfriend came to rob us. But this next part that I'm about to share always makes my blood run cold. You see, the guy who robbed us held my brother at knife point and said that if he didn't comply that he would stab all of us upstairs as a punishment for him getting in the way. The cops asked my brother to give him a description, but he didn't. Later on the same day, we then heard a truck park on the side of the house. Whoever was in it, they yelled, threw a glass bottle down and drove off. I'm not sure if it was the same man who robbed us, but it terrified me nevertheless. I'm really grateful that nothing happened to my brother or my family, but I guess it just goes to show that you really just cannot trust anyone in this world. This story occurred a few years back. I would have been around 8 or 9 at the time. So my old bedroom sat facing out towards the street and also happened to be right next door to our front door. It was very small as it had been built in place of our old front porch. The roof was slanted downward, sort of towards the window, which took up most of the wall, and the bed could only fit in one way. It was painted purple, not a nice purple either, like a kid's bedroom, of course. But my bed sat facing towards the door to my bedroom, parallel to the window. My closet took up part of the corner between my bedroom door and the window, making for a sort of unusual space, I guess. And every night, I would always check to make sure the curtains were shut all the way, as the idea of people watching from the street made me really uncomfortable, even at a young age where things like that shouldn't have even really crossed my mind, I guess. Every night, I slept soundly, no nightmares, no sudden noises waking me in the middle of the night, nothing. That was until the middle of the year during a school break. I remember waking to the sound of just someone breathing. I couldn't move, couldn't catch my breath. I was just sort of stuck. But what I do remember seeing so clearly was a man stood in the corner of my room, stuck partly behind the curtain as if it would hide him. Of course, I could see him though. He was just this dark entity who stood and watched me. And after what felt like hours, I was able to get back to sleep. In the morning, I told my mum about what happened, and she explained that it was just a strange nightmare and that I would be fine. But the way she said it was just very not believable, I guess. These cases of sleep paralysis, too, went on for about a year, taking me up to the middle of the next year when I was likely 8 or 9. I remember waking in the middle of the night, just like I had most nights for the last year, to the man in the corner. Only this time, I could move. I didn't dare move, though. I stayed absolutely still, despite now knowing that he was actually there. I could hear his faint breathing, like he was trying to hide from me as much as I was trying to hide from him. I couldn't help but think, has this man been here every night this year? I remember the thoughts that I had, how I would run out of the room and scream for my mum, how she would call the police, how this man would be arrested and sent away. But I just couldn't do that. I mean, he was basically in front of the door. Instead, I spent the night staring at him, trying to fall asleep. I'd say it was around 5 a.m. I was finally able to drift off, just sort of as the birds started to wake up, really. I woke up and, lo and behold, he was gone. The first thing that I did was tell my mum. She already looked uneasy, like she already knew as well. And that's when I heard 2 people talking outside. I found out later the people outside were my neighbor and a police officer who was taking an eyewitness statement. Because apparently, around 6 in the morning, our neighbor spotted a man standing outside of my window. She called the police, but he was gone before they arrived. Other neighbors stepped forward saying that they'd seen him outside in the middle of the day, looking at our house too. There were no signs of forced entry, only 2 footprints in the flower bed outside of my window. My mother told the officers my account of what happened, and they came to the conclusion that he'd done the same thing last year. I saw it, and it sparked my tangent of sleep paralysis. The streetlight outside projected his shadow, so it appeared as though he was standing in my room. This whole time, he'd been waiting patiently outside of my room. Honestly, who knows what would have happened too if my neighbor didn't spot him on her way out to work. Just a few minutes and she could have missed him entirely. G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and I would like to give Chime a big shout out for sponsoring this episode. So, no one likes waiting on a paycheck when the bills are coming in. I've had times in the past when the bills just kept piling up and I kept checking my accounts nervously so that I didn't incur any late fees. And well, the good news is that now you can get your paycheck up to 2 days earlier with direct deposit with Chime. That's up to 2 more days to save, pay bills, and generally feel better about your money situation. And Chime is more than just about getting paid early too. It's also an award-winning mobile app, checking account, debit card, and optional savings account. So, what are you waiting for? Hopefully, not your paycheck. Get started with Chime today. Applying for a free account takes less than 2 minutes. Get started at chime.com/be scared. That's chime.com/be scared. And in the spirit of transparency, just know that banking services and debit card is provided by the Bancorp Bank or Stride Bank, NA members FDIC. And early access to direct deposit funds depends on the payer. When I have to walk to my bus stop, it's always 5 in the morning. Given that it's only entering summer or spring for me now, it's only starting to lighten up at this time. This happened though mid to end of fall, so it was still pretty dark out at 5. During my walk, I have to walk along a sort of non-busy road with few lights that often go out too because of the timing, so it's pretty dark there. I live right by a middle school, but they started around 8, so it's empty that early in the morning. I was walking past this school too when this car had pulled up and into the parking lot. They had rolled down their window and said something to me. I couldn't really hear it exactly, but I sort of sped up. It left the parking lot and drove up again to the intersection. I noticed the car had very tinted windows and also had no license plate on it, front or back. The car was waiting to turn, despite there being no reason not to, as there were no cars passing by. I stood still, and it was at this point that I called my dad, then waiting until I watched it turn and drive away before continuing to walk. It's about a 15-minute walk between my house and the bus stop, and my mum had taken my pepper spray, so I didn't have it on me. I stayed on the phone with my dad for the rest of the call, but I think about this often when I'm walking and how I'm only ever the only person walking the path at 5 o'clock in the morning. I make sure to keep my pepper spray on me these days and my finger on the trigger. However, I'm looking to get something more like a pocket knife or a taser instead. I feel pepper spray would have been severely ineffective in this situation. This is something that happened to me when I was around 15 or 16. I, a 24-year-old female now, used to be painfully shy as a kid, so I had a few small groups of friends that I was always around. My first day of sophomore year, I met this guy. His name was Seth, 18 to 19-year-old male, in one of the classes who seemed a little bit strange. I didn't think too much of it though at the time because he seemed really nice, to be honest. Finally, it was time for my favorite period, lunch. Lunch was reserved for my favorite people, 2 boys who graciously accepted awkward 13-year-old me after a dramatic move to my dad's home. One of the boys was actually my best friend and my first boyfriend. His name was Jay. So we were really close, and I trusted him more than anyone else at the time. The other, his name was Harry, was in the same class with me where I met Seth. Anyway, I sit at our table and we begin to start comparing teachers when Seth randomly joins our table. I figured that he was one of their friends or something, so we just continued like normal. After a few weeks, I started getting a little bit creeped out by Seth. He seemed to be sort of like everywhere that I went into school and always stood way too close to me. If I asked him to take a step back, he would point out other guy friends who stood closer. It was usually the same two guys he would use as examples. For context, I'm in a wheelchair and he was really tall, so my head was the same level as that area. I eventually found out that he had seen what my school login was and saved it to his computer. Now, I didn't want to immediately freak out and report him, so I decided that I was going to just ask him to delete it. He said that he would and that was the end of that. But as the months go on, Seth started to get worse. The class that we had was a film class where the students would go out during the period in groups to do the project independently. This was very scary too because he would immediately claim me in his group and I was too nice to decline until we were put into pairs. He always tried to get me to go film with him in the back fields behind our school. The way that he would suggest it to, it got me so scared that I would refuse to leave the room. My teacher was amazing and didn't force anyone to go out, but he would end up doing it alone and I would edit it. Now, while Seth was out, I decided to see if he deleted my login, and he hadn't. He had at least 20 other logins saved on this document, and I was scared enough at this point to report it to my counselor. My counselor was a complete idiot, for a lack of better terms, and decided to tell him that a girl in his class had reported him. I found out because the next day he came to lunch and started accusing me and seemed really angry. I denied it, and Jay and Harry stuck up for me. It was shortly after this that I found out that neither of my friends actually knew Seth. He only knew of me when he joined our table. My counselor decided that my concerns were not important enough to notify our teacher or police. I guess it wasn't serious enough to warrant anything outside the school. They didn't even notify my dad, believe it or not. After everything happened with the report, though, he went back to being creepy, but in a worse way this time. Every day he would try to convince me to go somewhere with him behind our school, and it had gotten to the point that he was trying to tell me that I had to. He would make up excuses for us to go somewhere alone. I didn't tell anyone about it besides the school and my teacher later, because at that time I wasn't sure if it was just me being crazy or not. I do think that my friends might have expected that he was getting too pushy because they started walking with me to classes when they could. I ended up telling my teacher what was going on, and he immediately started assigning seats and talked to another girl in my class to see if I could permanently join her group. Seth graduated at the end of that year and decided to resurface in my email inbox when I was 17 or 18. But at that point, I blocked him. Between the ages of 2 and 5, I had an imaginary friend named Charlie. He was tall and thin with grey hair and brown eyes, probably around 50 to 60 years old. And the first warning sign was his age, as most imaginary friends are the same age as the child, right? He was kind, though. We played together a lot. Dolls, swing sets, toys. My grandma caught me talking to him once and asked who I was talking to. I told her that I was talking to Charlie. She asked about him, so I explained him to her. What he looked like, how he acted, what he did, etc. My grandpa walked in on our conversation and was interested too, and got more and more surprised as I went on. And he went on to tell me this. A man named Charlie lived in the house next to ours in the 50s when he was growing up. Pa said that he didn't remember a lot about him, just that he was really tall and had an old car that left a big trail of black smoke behind it. The house Charlie supposedly lived in was just a stone porch now, as the rest of it burned down decades ago. Charlie had a wife, Eliza. She died a few years after they got married. She apparently ended her own life. His next wife, Rose, though, lived in another city and refused to move down to Charlie's house until he built her a porch. So he did, and they married and she moved in. She died about 9 or 10 years later. She was getting ready for bed apparently when her nightgown caught on fire from the fireplace in their room. Everything in the house got burnt down with her, everything except the porch, which didn't have even a burn mark on it apparently. The wooden door leading to the porch was completely fine too. It's still there, in fact, and I go see it every time that I visit my grandparents. Anyway, Charlie, he died in the 1960s from heart failure. He lived with his sister until he passed away, and I suppose that he must have come back to see how everything was doing, and apparently decided to stay. This story goes back to when I was 14 years old. I lived with my grandparents, but had regular visitation with my mother. My mum and I were on good terms, and summer was coming up, so she planned a small family get-together on a weekend that I would be at her house. I was super excited for this because I could see my cousins and relatives from that side of the family, for the weekend that is, and spend the rest of the week with my mum. And the first day went really great. We went mudding and got messy and had a really good time together. When night came, things really cooled down a bit, and we decided that we would watch a movie. So we watched a movie about greasers and had a character named Ponyboy in it. I know the name of the movie, but I can't think of it at the moment. But anyway, it was not a scary film by any means. Bedtime hits, and I struggled with insomnia and stayed up later than most of the people staying over that night. When I finally went to bed, I swore that I could hear knocking on the bedroom door. Yeah? Hey, it's Mike. Come to the kitchen. The problem with this whole scenario is that my Uncle Mike was in the house and had a very thick country accent. This voice sounded like it was trying badly to fake that accent. No, I'm trying to get some sleep. I'm making a cake and I left you the knife to cut it with. This didn't make any sense to me at all. So I opened the door and said, I'm not cutting a damn cake at like 1 a.m. When I did, there was nobody there. But there was a large knife by the door. For some reason, I assumed Mike was joking with me, so I put the knife up in the kitchen and got the strangest onset of fight or flight that I have ever had. So I ran. I ran into a room my cousin was sleeping in because he was 3 or 4 years older than me, and I just acted on instinct. When I ran into the room, the door was shut, and I opened it, closed it, and I locked it. I woke him up and tried to explain what was up, but he just sort of tossed over and said that I could sleep with him in his bed if I wanted. I was scared and remember seeing that it was like 1:30 in the morning at this point. Mr. Lonely was playing and a pale blue light was in the room. The next morning comes and my aunt asks me why I was knocking on their bedroom door asking her to come to the kitchen that night. I tell her that I wasn't. She asks why my cousin's door was open with the light on at 2 a.m. I tell her that I ran in and closed the door and locked it at 1:30 and there was only a blue nightlight on. She tells me that it was not what she saw, and she said that she saw the door completely open, the lights on, and could hear talking from the room. When I asked her why her husband Mike was knocking at my door at 1 a.m., she said that Mike went to work at midnight and didn't come back until 6 in the morning. We all got suspicious at this and took a flip phone around asking questions and got audio captured saying, I am Mike and I am still here, very clearly. We didn't hear it when we asked it, but we did in the recording. I don't know what happened that night, but it never happened again to my knowledge, and it still bothers me all these years later. Now, I know that this is really weird, so bear with me, but it happened about 6 months ago. As I was falling asleep, a mean, sort of evil voice said, "Your dad's going to die." It was really evil sounding. It was so scary, in fact, that I prayed to God to protect my dad because I really wasn't sure if it was a dream or not. It felt real and vivid, but obviously I didn't tell anyone about it. The very next day, I started feeling like really dizzy and nauseous, and It was so bad that I couldn't even stand up straight. The whole room was spinning at one point. Then my dad called me. He said that he was scared because he was dizzy and nauseous as well. It was really weird because it was like I was experiencing the exact same thing at that very moment. I was asking him questions like if he had chest pains, and suddenly he just stopped responding. I'm like, "Dad, answer me or I'm calling 911. And there was no response, so I called 911. My dad lives like 35 minutes from me, and I felt pretty helpless at the time. I prayed again and remembered my dream and was in a total panic. My dizziness went away and the paramedics got there and my dad was conscious. He refused to go to the hospital because he's stubborn like that. But long story short, we went to a doctor, had a CT scan done, and one of his arteries was severely blocked and he suffered a mini stroke. He had surgery and he's doing okay these days. However, his memory is worse than ever and I'm scared about vascular dementia at this point. I'm still glad that he's here, and the odd thing is that, why did the voice sound so evil, I guess? I mean, it literally warned me. I believed my prayers helped the situation, but I'm really confused about it. There's no way that this was just a coincidence. I mean, it literally happened the next day, and anyway, the whole thing was really weird, something that I'll never forget, and I just thought that I should share it. This is an encounter from a few years back now. I think autumn of 2017. I'll try to remember what was said, but I admit that it might be a bit off. It was a dark part of the year, only a few streetlights, but the wet asphalt seemed to absorb all the light and make the scenery even darker where I lived. So I had moved into my late mum's house a few years before. It was in a nice neighborhood, but close to one particularly bad area, and it also had a really bad apartment building that was known as Murder Alley. It was a dangerous neighborhood, with a few mailmen killed, doors broken with axes, passers-by thrown at with old TVs, stones and more, drug users and shady people living there. I was suspicious towards strangers on the streets and avoided telling where I lived pretty much all the time. But one evening I left to the store, a short walk away, and met a stranger, just after leaving my yard, that is. He had dirty clothes, greasy hair, and seemed kind of off right away. But he came towards me and started to talk. "Hey, where does," and he gave a name, "live?" He asked this in a sort of annoyed tone. I have no idea who he's looking for, so I say, sorry, I really don't know." "Why?" He sounded even more annoyed. "Well, I don't live here," I said, as I tried to stay calm. I hurried past him and didn't look back. I was too scared to possibly find him staring at me even more, or following me. He was a big guy, heavily built and maybe like a bit over 6 foot, and I was a 5-foot tiny woman. I just went to the store and I did my shopping. Afterwards, I started walking home and I saw the guy standing right in the shadows behind the shop's corner. I kept walking, and when turning in my driveway, I glanced behind me and I saw him following me, and I walked through my dark yard inside my house and didn't put the lights on but peeked through the window facing the street. The guy was standing there next to my mailbox, staring at my window. I sort of took a few steps back, freaked out, and just waited in the dark. I messaged my friend group what was happening so they could check on me if something happened. I said that I had an axe next to my door if the guy would try to come in. One of my friends, my now boyfriend, told me to call the police at once. I took a glance outside again quickly, and the strange guy turned away and just left. So I didn't end up making the call. I never saw that dude again, but I'm really glad that I didn't get to turn into an axe murderer in self-defense. The murder alley was torn down a couple of years after, and the bad vibe disappeared with it. The area is now way more peaceful than it has ever been since the apartment building was built in the 1960s. It was the summer of '87, and I was 4 years old at this time. I remember this too like it was yesterday, but I, a male 38 now, used to live in a small town in southern Indiana in '87. The schools were shut for the summer break. Me and my cousin, who'd frequent us from another city 100 miles away, went out to play on scorching summer afternoons. We had found this massive pile of construction sand at a nearby site where we would spend most of the time making sandcastles and such. Right next to this massive pile of sand was a large water tank built with poured concrete and filled to the brim with water. Me and my cousin, when we'd get bored with the sand, would sometimes sit by this large tank. It did appear to be large for us 4 and 6-year-olds, I think now anyway, and we would look at the tadpoles, which my older cousin convinced me were small fish. Neither of us could swim at this age, and being cautious even at that age, never ventured too close to the tank. That day, for some reason, what I do not recall was that my cousin had to head back to his home 100 miles away rather abruptly, cutting short his stay with us. I, being the only child, feeling lonely with nothing else to do, decided to head back to the construction sand pile. But there was this other kid, a bit older than I was, who'd I'd never seen before. He was sitting by the water tank and chucking a piece of rope with a stick tied to one end in the water, and would pull it back. I simply loved this toy that he'd fashioned out of rope plus a stick, and asked if I could join him. For sure, he said. He made up rules of a new game, rather on the spot. You sit at the other end of the tank, I'll chuck the stick end of the rope at you, holding the rope end. If you manage to catch it, then you win your turn. If it hits the water, you'll lose a point. Deal? What 4-year-old could say no to this, right? So yeah, we started this game. I think I caught it a few times. Some other times the stick landed in the water. He was losing and he kept shortening the throw so that I had to keep reaching for the stick. And one fateful throw, I landed in the water. It was sudden too, and I didn't realize what was happening. I was inside the water, struggling to get out, trying to hold my breath and flailing my arms. Luckily, I managed to get hold of a rung on one end of the corners of the tank, and also managed to climb out. The other kid, well, was nowhere to be found. He comes back about 20 or so minutes later. Oh, you managed to come out. I looked at him fuming. Where did you get lost? I remember asking angrily. Oh, I just went to pee, he said nonchalantly. I never thought you'd make it out. The water is deep. Did you not try to find grown-ups and tell them I was drowning? He just shrugged. For a long time I remembered this incident, every detail, what I wore that day, except something else came to light, rather unexpectedly years later, when I was talking about this with my dad. Yeah, I know how it would have bothered you so much, feeling betrayed by your own cousin like that when you were drowning. Yeah, years later I realized that I had processed every bit of that incident and changed one crucial aspect in my head. There was no strange kid that day. It was my own cousin, my partner in crime. Every summer break, that for some reason, only known to him, decided to let me drown or fend for myself. So I just want to say from the outset that I'm really not very good at sharing stories, but I decided to share my experience, and I'm curious to see what you guys make of it. I'm not religious, and up until this point, I didn't even believe in the paranormal. My rationale, as crazy as it sounds, is that because I hung 2 pairs of shoes on a shoe tree, I experienced 2 hauntings. So, I was 20 years old and recently entered the gay dating world. I was seeing this guy for a bit, introduced him to my best friend. My date suggested that we all go on a late-night drive along the rich country estates and past a massive shoe tree. I recently had 2 pairs of worn shoes or boots that I didn't really need, so I brought them along to add to the tree's collection. Despite my best friend's objections, I hung the 2 pairs of shoes. On the drive back to the city, my date Google searched the shoe tree at that intersection, and supposedly people hang shoes on the tree to commemorate a couple that were murdered at that intersection like a century ago. The next night, my date took me to the movies. We drove back to my house and we were chatting in the car at the end of my driveway. He was telling me about work and stuff like that when I noticed the port light sort of activate about 14 houses down the road. I noticed a figure in the driveway. They were tall and wore a white flowing sheet over their head with distinct long sleeves. I pointed out to my date, and we both start getting a bit nervous as it seems to be staring right at us, unmoving. After a minute, the figure turns towards the porch light. The light goes out and the figure just disappears. 2 houses closer to us, though, the porch light activates again, and we see the same figure standing on that porch, swaying back and forth. The light goes out and the figure disappears again, and again, 2 houses closer, the port light activates and the figure is standing in the driveway. At this point, we're obviously freaking out, and my date drives us away before it gets any closer. Eventually, I made it home, but I didn't get much sleep that night. The next day, my parents went out, and I was loading up the laundry in the basement. I heard my dad's footsteps come back in the house on the main floor. Must have forgotten something, I thought. I heard him walk from the front door to the back door, back and forth, sort of over and over again. As I go to check it out, I hear my dad climb the stairs to the top floor. I reach the main floor. The front door is still locked, and my parents are gone, and someone is in my house now. I don't know where the courage came from, but I ran up those stairs to confront whoever this was, and when I reached the top floor, it was just completely silent. There are 5 rooms upstairs, and the bathroom in front of me is the only room that I can see inside perfectly. I run inside the bathroom quickly and lock the door, and as soon as I do, the footsteps start up again, from one end of the hall to the other, slowly getting louder and shorter until they're stomping right outside the bathroom door. I yell, "Leave me alone," and as soon as I did that, the stomping just ended. My parents arrive home a few minutes later, and that was it. These are the only 2 experiences that I've ever had, mind you, and all I know is that I will never throw old shoes on a shoe tree ever again. My parents moved from Ireland to Middle England in the early 90s, into a house that was built in the early 1900s. It's a pretty Georgian, semi-detached, and next door, which used to be part of the garden, an older couple lived who became very close to my family and were basically our grandparents. The woman, Em, grew up in our house, and they built their house on what was once the garden and ours to look after their aging mother and mother-in-law. Em's mother was a wealthy woman. They had live-in maids and would have been quite upper class back in the day. But unfortunately, her children were all ailing in some way. Her eldest boy died at 4, and Em had diabetes. In fact, she was one of the first people to receive insulin, which saved her life in her late teens. And the youngest boy was very disabled, physically challenging and nonverbal. My granddad, Jay, thought that he may have had some sort of a locked-in syndrome, with quite a lot of intellectual gifts beneath an inability to communicate, and mental illness too. By the way, I lost my granddad last year. Em died many years ago. He was my best friend and a soulmate. A war veteran at 101 died alone due to COVID, which was just really unfair. I'd love anyone listening to this to spare a thought for his memory, as he was the most awesome dude that I'd ever met. I have so many stories from him and his century-long life. If anyone wants me to start to separate another story about that, I would love to do it. But anyway, in 2011, after working far too hard in my early 20s and my first job after university, college for my transatlantic cousins, I felt totally burnt out, to be honest. 6 years of intense higher-level schooling and then a 60-hour work week. So I moved back for a bit just to take a breather whilst finding another job. 3 weeks in of my being there, the disabled brother, Granddad Jay's brother-in-law, unfortunately died. He would have been in his 90s. In 2011 too, it began within days of Jay's brother-in-law's death. First of all, just a kind of, an eerie feeling as if I was being watched. I wondered if I'd developed some kind of anxiety problem, as I had suffered panic attacks for a brief spell in my teens. Then, scratching. We'd never had a bird or a mouse problem before, so I asked my parents. My dad was so often working away, to be honest, but he was there sometimes. I asked them if we should have pest control come over and check the walls of the house. They said that it had only been quite recently, so we should wait for a while. Maybe it was some roosting pigeons nestling the last weeks of their fledglings or something like that. But then, a kind of tapping or rapping sound started, almost like someone was gently knocking from within the bricks of the house. I became so used to the strange sounds too around me that I lost all interest in trying to find the source. Usually, taps, knocks, and bangs were all accounted for. I presumed maybe old pipes had become unsecured or next door had rats. But I also ignored the fact that we lived in the house for 20 years and had none of these problems before. One morning, though, I woke up with a bit of a start. It was dusk, about 5 a.m. The old TV that had sat abandoned for 6 years in the corner of my brother's old room where I was sleeping was now clicking madly. The walls were scratching. The knocking, even though the heating was off and it was summer, so no pipes could have been causing it, was just in a frenzy. I stared around for a few seconds, completely in terror and shock, and realized almost instantly that this was paranormal energy. When I say the energy was frenzied, I mean it too. It was like a quietish cacophony. I filmed it on my old phone, in fact, and have it on my laptop somewhere. And when people say that you can't film this stuff, yes, you can. I know nothing about the paranormal. In fact, I used to laugh at horror films. So why would it come into my head so strongly and completely that this was what it was? I found that really strange. This went on for days, though, and I even mentioned it to my mum. She laughed it off. My mum is an accountant and super intelligent and a practical person. She is where unnecessary drama goes to die, to be honest. But I googled it and I found an article. And what was creepy about it, and scares me to this day, was that it was textbook what was happening to me. The scratches, the tappings, how it seemed to be getting louder, and how the sounds began to feel intentional, like 3 obvious knocks rather than just tapping, really human. Also that I never felt fear like it. I could have a wonderful evening, laughing with friends. They go home, I'd go to bed feeling warm and wonderful, and then I awoke. Unlike ever before in my life, somewhere between like 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. too, with the most unbelievable sense of dread that frankly did not feel like it came from me. I mean, I did not feel like the source of it or anything. And then the nightmares came. I felt like the more that I thought about it, the more it fed off my energy or something. Like there was a legit psychological level to all of this. That was the worst part of all of it too. The nightmares, they were always the same as well. I woke up, only I couldn't move. Sleep paralysis, I guess. And there was a dark presence in the room, sometimes in the form of a shadow in the corner, a large male shadow, and the most ominous feeling that I've ever felt. Terror and danger unlike anything that I could ever have imagined. I had never, and have never, had nightmares before or since this too. Maybe the odd small one, but I don't really get them. What I mean is that I haven't had any experience like it since, actually. Typing about it even spooks me out because I feel like the energy you let out is whatever this thing fed on. Despite this, though, I just chalked it up to anxiety and told my mum that I was no longer sleeping in that room, and she said that she would swap. So I chose to go on the sofa instead. The next few days were fine and peaceful too, until Mum came down one morning completely ashen-faced. I asked if she was okay, and she described getting sleep paralysis, even though she didn't know what it was, for the first time in her life, may I add, and described, well, my experience. The male shadow figure, I had never told her about this, by the way, in that same corner, with the same feeling. Jay's brother-in-law was over 6 foot, by the way, and he was an angry, tortured soul. And that room, it was Em's old room. She also had the classic incubus thing. I didn't have that, thankfully, but when I told her to Google it, and it was a real thing, she was horrified how similar her experiences were to others, because she had never heard this either. Things got worse from there too. Whatever this was grew angrier, and every night, just as you were about to drift into sleep, literally that second of losing consciousness, there would be a huge bang on the bed's headboard, like the whole strength of an incredibly strong man wrenching you from sleep. It was happening in every room now too. It was at this time that we started to get insomnia. Not sleeping for the best part of like 3 months is, well, terrible, let me tell you. I was getting really fed up though, and was just a nervous wreck, and it was at this point that I decided to move out. But before I did, I called a carbon monoxide person to check for leaks, and there wasn't any. A week before I moved out, things started happening in the day, and even my father, who would angrily shut it all down repeatedly, he's more stubborn than an ocean of mules and hates anything remotely dramatic or whimsical. He's a working-class Irishman scientist through and through, and deeply resents the magical thinking of the Catholic stuff. He was brought up with it, but even he agreed to finally get some spiritual help, maybe even a priest. The night that we decided on that too, I woke up with one of the huge bangs, only to find books on my floor. I finally had evidence to show my parents, and they couldn't deny that. I didn't throw them. I couldn't have, in fact. I didn't even leave my bed. I just screamed, and they came in, and they would have heard if I had left my bed. Those last few days included audible growls at some points. I even recorded a few. Incredibly strong smells of male sweat mixed with some kind of ammonia. And my sister, she was visiting, and I, running and screaming almost over to the neighbor's house because I was explaining how the knocks were intentional, like sometimes 1, 2, 3. And as soon as I finished saying that, 3 there were. 3 very loud, intentional knocks on the door right next to us. Also, my name was whispered so many times. Whatever this was wanted us to know that it was hearing us. My mum said that she was also pushed across the landing against a wall in the middle of the day at one point. But in any case, I left. Mum went to church for the first time in like 20 years. She only went a few times, but she said that it helped. I came back to visit 3 months later. One morning when I heard my mum come down for breakfast, I turned to her and we both said, "It's gone," at the same time. Like I said, I've never had any experience before or since like this. Me or anyone in my family too. Never had any bad nightmares in the 10 years since. I now have this theory too that humans are monumentally egotistical when it comes to thinking that the universe begins and ends within the realms of our limited 5 senses. It's not completely unfeasible to think that there are sentient beings or entities or maybe even animals we cannot easily detect. So, do I believe? Oh, no, not resolutely, because it was only one period of time in my life, and it was fairly short and contained. But do I now keep a very open mind where I once laughed it all off? Absolutely. My dad denied it ever happened, but Mum and I, we aren't so foolish. Lastly, please feel free to ask me any questions too. There's so much I haven't said, and it happened like over 10 years ago, so there's a lot I've forgotten, I would guess, and will probably remember if prompted. Also, my fingers hurt, and I want to stop for now. I just want to send some love and some peace to all of you guys as well after such a difficult global pandemic, and I hope this story doesn't upset anyone. That's not my intention. It's more for an open discussion and to just get it off my chest. For anyone who may be scared though, I moved back to this house 4 years later and I'm still here, and it remains one of the most lovely and homely feeling places ever. Obviously, I'm a little bit biased though. I guess what I'm just trying to say is that I've never experienced anything like it since. And I guess you could say that nothing is bad forever. So when I was about 11, maybe 12, my family and I moved out to the middle of some abandoned strip mines in rural Alabama. And let me tell you, it was awesome. Going swimming in the quarries, lots of abandoned equipment and cliff faces to climb, caves and miles of trails, abandoned dirt roads used by the mines too, and all of it we could explore. The trade-off though was there were a lot of venomous snakes, and at night it got really dark real quick. There were no streetlights, just the occasional porch light maybe every mile or so on the main road. But we loved it because of all the freedom that we had. One day in particular though, my friend P and I were out on one of the dirt roads that went off to the side of the main road. We hadn't been down that road before, but it was like 10 a.m. on a bright summer day and we figured why not. We had gone maybe a mile down that road and came to a left-hand turn eventually. And beside that left-hand turn and alongside that road that we were walking on was a sort of small lake. We walked up to this lake and were watching small frogs and a turtle swimming around when I caught movement across the lake. I saw a man walking away from us, heading up the hill. I poked P and pointed. "Who's that? Why is he out here?" We were miles into the mines at this point, no people anywhere, no houses nearby, and we both stood up. As soon as we got right on our feet too, he stopped walking. And in a split second, he just spun around and came running in our direction. We bolted, and I mean we ran, like Gump. I looked back and he was running faster than any human that I'd ever seen though. He covered the distance. He had to run down the hill and around the lake to get close to us. That route was easily 300 yards, but he got to us in seconds. P grabbed me and we jumped off the road and into a ditch behind some bushes. I peeked out and he was maybe 30 or 40 inches from us, spinning around in the road, making this awful grunting sound. Weirdly enough, I swear he had an entire cooked chicken in his hand. He was wearing destroyed overalls, dirty boots, and he had what I can only describe as a Cro-Magnon brow. Huge. My memory might not be super accurate given how long it's been, but it seemed like his forehead stuck out a good 4 inches over his eyes too. He was the scariest thing that I'd ever seen. He just spun around in the road and started running back the way that he came too. We just stayed there in that ditch for almost an hour, I think, afraid to move, listening and watching in case he was hiding and waiting for us. Eventually we crawled along the roadside all the way back to the main road. From there we walked but stayed in the tree line until we saw the main paved road. And then when we got there, we just ran all the way back home, got home, told our fathers, and both of our fathers and P's older brothers loaded up and went looking for him, but never found a thing. All these years later, and it still haunts me what I saw that day. Oh, and my girlfriend recently took me out to her grandmother's house to meet and spend time with her family. And where does her dear old granny live? Yeah, you guessed it. Right on the edge of those same strip mines. I told her the story and she looked really serious at me and said, "You guys are really lucky. There's all kinds of bad things that happen in those mines." So yeah, every visit to Grandma means the Glock and the 12 gauge ride with us. And that was the creepiest encounter that I've ever had. When I was 8 years old, my family moved from my original childhood home in a 120-year-old house with a lot of history. It was a beautiful house, but there had been a big fire in it many years ago, and it was abandoned for like 15 years. I really didn't like the house when we first moved. The energy just felt off, and I felt like I was constantly being watched. There were certain rooms where the energy felt so off that I refused to go in there alone. We also ended up moving my bedroom after 1 or 2 years because I hated the energy in the room and just couldn't explain it to anyone. My parents wrote these feelings off as just being a scared 8-year-old, but the feelings about specific rooms maintained until we moved out when I was 18. A lot of strange occurrences happened during the 10 years that I lived in this house, so much so that in high school I started to wonder if I could be schizophrenic, even though these occurrences happened exclusively at home, and since moving I haven't experienced anything. I was constantly seeing things out of the corner of my eye or hearing footsteps when I was home alone, but I'm going to share 2 experiences that really stand out in my memory. So for my 13th or 14th birthday, I had a few girlfriends sleep over in the living room. Some of them had never been to my house before, and I didn't tell them anything about it because I just wanted everyone to have a good time and not feel spooked. The next morning, though, one friend asked why my dad was walking between our sleeping bags for a while last night. I immediately knew that that wasn't my dad. My parents went up to bed while we were still awake, and my dad confirmed that he didn't get up in the night. My friend, though, didn't particularly want to sleep over after that first night, and to be honest, I couldn't blame her. Another experience that I vividly remember happened when I was coming home from a party in high school one day. It was after midnight, but I was definitely sober because I drove that night. I was entering the back door that was in the backyard and opened into the kitchen. We never used the front door of our house. And as I was putting my key in the door, I looked through the glass pane on the door. The view went straight through to the kitchen and into the hallway near the front of the house. And at one side of the hallway wall, in view, was a full-length mirror hanging up, and in the brief few seconds that I was looking through the glass on the door, I saw a very distinct, solid-looking figure run out of the mirror. I know that this is going to sound weird, but it looked like it was in the position that sprinters are in when they sort of crouch down to start a race, and it looked like it was wearing a royal blue sort of morph suit. Weird, I know, but that's what I thought that I saw. The figure ran out of the mirror and dissipated into the staircase on the other side of the hallway. After seeing that, I remember booking into my bedroom, closing the door, and falling asleep with the lights on and the TV on that night. All that being said, I believe that whatever was in my house with us wasn't malicious. We took good care of the house, and I like to think that the spirits appreciated us for that. I don't know if that's just me trying to make myself feel better or if that's actually what happened. So, I absolutely want to make clear that this story is true. My wife and I both witnessed this, and we'll never forget what we saw last night. I'm a 43-year-old man, a former Marine with a lot of time at sea, and a former railroader. So, I have been to a lot of places that are just hard to get to for most folks, and I have never seen anything like what we saw last night. It happened on Highway 50 in between Penrose and Pueblo, Colorado. My wife was working a closing shift in Cannon City last night. I left and made the drive west as usual. After she clocked out, we went to pick up our son from his job, only to find that he wasn't working last night. On the drive back from there, you pass Penrose, and then there's this place that I've always called the Big Hole. The Big Hole is actually called Pierce Gulch. There is a significant drop in elevation, and then you immediately climb back up, hence the nickname. But as we were approaching Big Hole at about 12:40 a.m., something travelling from north to south crossed all 4 lanes and median of Highway 50 at an incredible rate of speed. We were the only vehicle out there at this time of night, and we nearly hit it. It was roughly 3 feet tall, I would say, and had long brown hair everywhere. And again, this thing was just booking it, faster than any animal I had ever seen or even heard of. My wife was driving and had our son on speakerphone. She was startled and looked at me and asked, "What the heck was that?" By this time we were down in the bottom of the gulch and headed back up the hill. We told our son what we saw, and she got off the call. We discussed it for a second and decided to go back and see if maybe it had gotten caught in the barbed wire fence or something. Maybe there was some trace of this thing, and we both were amazed by how fast it was moving, though. By 12:45, we had travelled back to the west side of the gulch and turned around. There wasn't any traffic, so my wife just slowly rolled down the shoulder of the highway, and I had my window down and was shining a flashlight that I had in the car out into the field. But there isn't much out there, obviously, except for cactus and stuff like that. But as we came up on the approximate area, we saw this thing. I told my wife, "Hey, look, do you see those eyes?" She said yes and stopped the car. 10 yards or so on the other side of the fence was a pair of very bright, very blue eyes, but not far off the ground. I was thinking that we probably were looking at a coyote or something. It was looking directly back at us, though. What happened next, I will never forget as long as I live, because whatever those eyes belonged to stood up like a man does, like a 6-7 foot man. They were still looking at us. Whatever it was that flew across the road at like Mach 2, this was definitely it. This was the hairy thing that we saw, and there was a moment of sort of disbelief and shock, I think. And then as it registered that we found the thing and it wasn't just some animal, the fear kicked in. I told my wife to go, just get out of here. It all seemed like slow motion, though. She floored the gas and the thing watched us leave, and we already knew that this thing was incredibly fast, so she drove as fast as she could up and out of the gulch, and I was looking out the back window and checking mirrors. My wife was afraid that it might be following us. Thankfully it wasn't, and I didn't want to make things worse by admitting that I was worried too. We drove very fast for several minutes. We talked, but it was like we were sort of each talking to ourselves, like, what was that, and was it waiting for us? Soon the lights from the west were ahead, and we were back into civilization. Once we got into the city, we finally started to relax a bit. We talked until we got home and then checked the car for anything. We couldn't really go to sleep for hours after that. My wife got online and was searching for anything that matched the creature that we saw. She found some stories, paranormal in nature, of other people witnessing a creature that sounded exactly like the one that we had seen. But she has to work the same shift tonight, so on our way out to the city, we're going to stop and go out into the field where we saw this thing and see if there's any evidence, footprints or hair or something. I'll update you guys if I find anything unusual. Wish me luck. This encounter happened many years ago, and I was very young at the time. It was in 2001 or 2002, and I was 11 or 12. My uncle was interested in purchasing some land near Red Oak, Oklahoma. I don't know exactly where, but it was several acres in a very remote area. My father, mother, and myself, we all decided to accompany him one Saturday to just scope out the property. From our home, it was a little more than a 3-hour drive, but we all love riding in the car, so while it was not going to be the most eventful road trip, we went just to get out of the house. Upon arrival, I remember being very underwhelmed by the place. No houses were anywhere near the place, and hardly even any signs of life at all, apart from like a few birds, and the wooded area wasn't exactly what I would call picturesque or anything. Still though, we parked our car off the road to go explore the woods a little. My uncle was talking about buying the land for hunting, not really my cup of tea. As we walked through the woods, it was a pretty nice day, but still something just felt off. Everyone in our group remarked about the eerie feeling, but my dad and uncle seemed to laugh it off. My mum had goosebumps and kept looking over her shoulder, which made me on edge too. She was very insistent, though, that it was weird and she wanted to leave, saying it felt like she was being watched. After a bit of hiking, I noticed that there was a small red building. I've seen bigger storage sheds in the suburbs, but it looked really well built. My uncle said that there was nothing about it on the listing, so but we went to peek inside. The door was open, and inside there were open cans of food, a ratty blanket on the floor, and it stunk unlike anything I'd ever smelt before. Following this discovery, though, we all agreed that it would be best to get back to the car if there was some crazy hermit living in the woods. We didn't want to be around to find him. The only issue was that we had walked pretty far into the woods and now weren't exactly sure which direction was correct. But the eerie feeling really amped up at this point, and we were all on edge. We ended up trekking another mile before we finally found the road, but we were further down from where we had parked the car, but at least we could just follow the road now. Walking along the road, though, we came across a truly unsettling sight. Right in the middle of the asphalt was a dark grey cat that had been set on fire. I have no idea why a cat was out in the middle of nowhere or how it came to be killed and set alight like that. Obviously, though, this had just happened, but there was nobody in sight. Naturally, we ran the rest of the way to the car, and when we got there was a huge scratch in the paint all down the side of it from the hood to the trunk. Thankfully, it was the only damage, and my dad was able to start it without any trouble, and we just drove away as fast as we possibly could. My heart is sped up just recounting this moment. Definitely one of the scariest of my life. Needless to say, though, my uncle did not buy the land. And I'll always remember this terrifying encounter, but like anything over time, I sort of pushed it to the back of my mind, and it just became one of those odd moments you occasionally retell at a family get-together years later, so much that it's almost a bit of a funny story now. The reason why I'm sharing this, though, is because I was actually reminded of it last night while binge-watching some episodes of BuzzFeed Unsolved on YouTube, when they shared the story of a family that disappeared in that same area, while also looking at some land for sale. The disappearance of the Jamison family is the name of the mystery in the video if you're interested, and the family allegedly died in the same area that we were searching roughly 7 years after we made our trip there. There are some theories about their deaths, including the allegations of some sort of cult in the area, complete with something even about dead cats. Coincidence? Probably, but the whole story gave me chills. So, if my family narrowly avoided being killed by some witches or a cult or whatever, or if we just stumbled upon a hermit who didn't want us in the woods, I'm just glad that we got out in one piece. So I take my dad's ashes up to Glacier National Park every year. I lived in Colorado when this story happened, and I was headed south through Idaho after I had visited Montana. My car broke down in Idaho, and a nice man helped me out. I was headed through the mountains to Boise to visit a friend. It was a 5-hour drive before I entered the truly mountainous section of Idaho, and I saw a hot spring on the side of this 2-lane highway along the Salmon River. I decided to take a dip after the stress of having my car breaking down. The hot spring had a bathhouse up at the top near the road, and a wheelchair ramp that went down to the area near the springs, where they were on the side of the river. The people had created little sort of bath-shaped sections in the river that were separated by river stones. Actually, you could sit in a spot that was shaped like a hot tub so that it held the water from the hot springs while the river rushed over it. I got out of my car in any case and headed down to the hot spring. I took my dog with me. It was twilight. About every half an hour a car passed by. Knowing that I was alone, essentially, I took off my top. I was sitting in the hot spring and actually took a photo of a car approaching. The car pulled up next to mine in front of the bathhouse. It was a truck with 3 men in it. Seamlessly, too, 1 man got out of the driver's side and 2 men got out of the passenger side. They moved without qualms and were covered in sort of heavy black gear. They looked like hunters, maybe, but I couldn't see the expressions on their faces. The driver headed down the wheelchair ramp towards me, not hesitating. He took big, long strides. I recognized that there was danger in this. The 2 passengers from the other side of the car headed down the steep bank, along the wheelchair ramp, taking a shortcut. I was now stuck in between both parties. Hastening, I hid and dressed myself under water while my dog growled. He never growls, mind you. I've only ever heard him growl like all of twice in my life, and this was the second time. The driver kept walking towards me. He walked onto the rocks in the river too, continuously walking towards me, even though he was covered in heavy gear that, if he actually fell in, he would be super waterlogged. The other two passengers from the side of the car were also walking on the rocks, directly in front of me now. The driver got so close that I had to grab my dog before he lashed out at the driver. I was freaking out, obviously. The man was walking out onto the stones, so he could reach me, and he was not hesitating one bit. Still, though, I couldn't see his face, but I grabbed my phone, my keys, and my clothes. I dragged my dog in between the two parties. My heart is in my ears. The driver would not stop, and he turned around very quickly, making an arc, coming for me still. He was still taking big strides as well, and the passengers were walking towards me as well. I was trapped in between them, and in the end, I had to run up the bank, dragging my dog pretty much by his collar all the way into my car. And the only way that I could get into my car without them grabbing me was by throwing my dog into the back and lunging myself into the passenger side door of my car. I threw my keys into the ignition and turned them right when the men were walking up between my car and their car. I happened to hit the lock button on the door right when they walked up, and before anything else happened or before I saw their faces, I ended up throwing myself into the driver's seat, reversing my car, and hightailing it right out of there. I drove about 20 minutes down the road, I crossed the river on the bridge, and I hid my car behind a bank near other campers. It was well hidden from the main road. The campers were looking at me wondering what was going on, and I sat and I waited. Another 10 minutes passed by, and lo and behold, the truck drove by. There was no doubt in my mind that the hunters, they were looking for me, and I managed to wait another half an hour and then drove up to the mountains, over to Boise, and into safety. So my dad owns some land in eastern Kentucky where I frequently ride and hike and hang out in the woods on my own. Currently, the trails that we use are overgrown with many trees down, so we can't actually take our ATVs up the mountain, and neither can anyone else. Surrounding the property is 4,000 acres of logging property and an old train tunnel that nobody really goes near. Sometimes our neighbours will walk our trails, but they only do it with their dogs or take up their ATVs, and typically only go at night to hunt or whenever we aren't there, mainly because they know that we don't condone them being on our property. Today, though, I decided to do some homework out near the creek, which runs through the main holler, which is a normal occurrence for me, really. This time, though, I decided to go back up much further into the woods than I typically do, just because I wanted to explore a bit more. Knowing the property pretty well, there was a trail above my head up the mountain about 100 feet that was overgrown that nobody could have gotten to on foot, not without a lot of work at least. I was hanging out as usual, and I'd been out in the woods for maybe an hour and a half at this point. It was around 5. Being summertime, though, the hollow was still lit up enough that I was comfortable out there. It had gotten quiet all of a sudden, though, and I suddenly heard a man yell, "Hey," almost like someone was trying to get my attention. The yell was very casual and conversational, and it sounded almost like when my dad yells "hey" at me. As soon as I heard it, I knew that it was coming from the trail above my head, and I also knew that I didn't hear anyone walk around, any tree limbs snapping, which there were a bunch on the ground up there, or even any leaves rustling. I immediately got out of my hammock and started back to my car and out of the woods. I didn't hear another hey or anything else. I got to my car and made it home and told my dad about what happened. He tried to explain it, saying that it could have been a neighbor, but we realized that that wasn't very likely, even if it was a neighbor, because I'd never met any of them, and why would they try to get my attention if they didn't know me and knew they weren't supposed to be on the property in the first place? That's when he told me that he had also heard something unexplainable out in the hollow by himself too. You see, he said earlier one morning when he was clearing trails, he heard a shriek that put chills down his spine. Growing up in the woods, he knows the sounds that foxes, bobcats, and all those animals make, and he's certain that it wasn't that. He'd never actually heard something like this before. He also mentioned that upon talking to the locals about the property, they called the hollow that I was in the Devil's Den. But we haven't gotten the chance to ask why yet. If anybody knows what might be out there, though, and how to defend myself, I'm all ears. Also, if you have any questions about anything, ask away and I'll do my best to answer. So I went camping with my mum, dad, and my brother deep in the woods when I was about 10 years old. I remember it was morning time and the sun was just rising. There was a slight fog present in the woods around us, and everyone kept remarking about how pretty it was. I had to go to the toilet, so I walked down a hill to the edge of the woods towards a wooden outhouse. It was a good distance away from where my family had set up camp, so I couldn't hear their conversations anymore. As I approached the wooden outhouse, I heard what I can only describe as disturbing wailing and whimpering coming from the woods behind it. I really can only describe it as sounding like several people sobbing together. I remember being absolutely petrified by these strange noises, but I figured it was just my imagination and went into the outhouse, did my business, and left. When I left the outhouse, I paused for a moment just to listen, but the wailing was now gone, and I noticed that the fog had also let up. It seemed weird, though, that the noises had stopped so quickly. I remember asking my parents if they saw anyone down there, or if there were people in the woods which freaked them out. When I told them what I heard, they accused me of making it up just to scare them, but to this day, I always wonder what the heck those noises were, because I've never heard anything like it since. I was wondering, though, if any of you guys had any idea as to what the noises may have been. My dad always jokes that it was a group of ghosts having a bad bowel movement. Yeah, he's one of those guys, but anyway, I would love to get your thoughts. Thanks for listening. In 2011, I was a sophomore in high school and was hanging out with my friend Hadley. We live in the Rust Belt, and the population of our area has declined a lot in the last 40 to 50 years, so schools were merged as a result of declining enrollment, which means that there are a lot of abandoned schools. I lived in a small town on the PA-Ohio border, and the abandoned school was a hotspot for teenagers and stuff who wanted to smoke and break windows and just overall cause havoc. My friend and I were in a breezeway type area. You could just step right in over a 1.5-foot wall because all of the glass had been broken out. And all of a sudden, a guy comes around the corner and grabs my friend, telling her to come with him. But we think it's a guy who intends to call the cops, so we just book it out of there and walk to my cousin's house down the street. It's the day before my aunt's birthday. Also, it was a supermoon that day. So all of my family is at my cousin's house and we hang out with them for a bit. They all end up going out to eat, but my cousin Hadley and I, we stay back at the house. It's now dark outside. We're sitting in my cousin's stoop and smoking cigarettes, when all of a sudden, we see a man walking down my cousin's driveway, from the direction of her garage, not the direction of the street. And he has his coat pulled over his mouth, and his hat pulled down to his eyes, so only his eyes and nose were visible, and he's making a strange gesture at us. At first glance, I thought that he was jangling keys at us, so me being stupid think that it's our uncle trying to give us the house keys, and I walk up to him, and my cousin says, "Jake, get away from him, man." And now that I'm a little bit closer, I can see what he's doing. He is touching himself. We turn around, run around the house to the front door. The door to the stoop was literally never ever used and was blocked with a bunch of stuff because it opened up to a storage room, and we thankfully get inside. The guy gets to the front door after us and finishes all over the sliding glass door, and then runs back towards her garage into the woods. We are totally freaking out. We call the cops, obviously. They ask us some questions, and then they leave. Now, About a week later, a girl who graduated from our high school heard about what happened and remember seeing a car parked on the street behind my cousin's garage and had actually taken down the license plate number. She reports the number to the police and it's registered to an Ohio man. We're in PA, but literally only about a quarter mile from the PA-Ohio border, so not much is really done. But then a few weeks later, this same car chases a woman from Walmart into Youngstown, Ohio, and attempts to follow her inside and sexually assault her. He's arrested. It turns out that he allegedly had a habit of trying to do this to people in Walmart parking lots in both Newcastle, PA, and Youngstown, Ohio. He faced charges in both states, and my cousin and friend and I were all subpoenaed to testify against him. When we go to court, we see his mugshot, and the guy who, touched himself and chased us. It was the same guy who grabbed my friend in the abandoned school that night. He wasn't going to call the cops either. He was going to try and have his way with her. He got a few years in prison, but I believe that he got out in 2015 or 2016 or something. So yeah, we were lucky that day, and for that, I'm eternally grateful. So, I think that this is important to the story. I was a preteen, you see, when this happened, but I hit puberty early enough that I looked like a young teenager. So, we used to have a tiny barn on my property, and it was my job to milk our dairy goats every morning. So, every single morning, at almost the exact same time, I'd be in the back corner of our lot to milk and all that stuff. It was in a fairly isolated area of our yard and between three neighbours' fields or pastures, which was intentional since goats can be talkative, so it was right beside our neighbour's chain link fence or grapevines. I would sing fairly loudly every morning too, since there was generally nobody to be bothered, and it calmed down the goats, at least a little. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is that it was easy to know that there was a girl back there every morning and night. This particular morning, though, my mum had a bad feeling and made my little brother go with me. He was bored, so he messed around and collected eggs while I milked. There were little windows all around, including a wide one right behind me, and the doors were wide open, so I figured that he'd come back eventually. Well, I saw him walk past the doors and start talking to somebody. I figured that it was the neighbour, so I didn't worry when he said, "Okay, I'll go get my mum," and took off. Then I heard the chain link fence behind me rattle, and I turned around just in time to see a man launch himself over the chain link fence into the neighbour's yard. Apparently, he'd been watching me and waiting since before I got into the yard. I don't know what he would have done if my mum hadn't have made my brother go with me that morning, but I did get out of goat milking solo, though, for quite some time. I live in a small rural community in the eastern US. It's a nice little town, and because of my work in the medical field, I've met some interesting folks. I'm also familiar with the law enforcement and emergency personnel. Small town life is not as dull and uneventful as people think, I guess, especially since everybody knows somebody who knows somebody. I have a lot of stories to share, in fact, but since this one just happened, I'll start here. Also, because it's still very recent and the investigation is ongoing, I have to be vague with some details, but I just need to tell someone. So, I'm single and I live alone. Due to a stalker, I've moved twice, but that's another story for another time. However, it is relevant for this story for multiple reasons. The first reason being that I have a dog for the sake of protection, as well as have motion sensors and outdoor security cameras. The second reason being that the location of my home, which is literally down the street from the fire department, I can see it from my living room window, is also a couple of blocks from the police station. However, next to the fire department is the road department, which is basically a parking lot where they park their road equipment and empty garbage trucks at night and on weekends. Oddly, it doesn't have a security camera. Small town life, I suppose. Anyway, my house sits on a hill with a good view of that side of the street, and due to the incline, the large trees in the front yard, and the half cornfield on the property next to me, most people on the street below wouldn't notice me in the backyard, unless they were sort of actively looking. However, I can see the street very clearly, and this incident happened Saturday evening. The county was holding its annual Independence Day spiel with a community barbecue, music, fireworks, etc. I didn't attend because it's just not my thing. Plus, I have a dog, like I said, and the sound of fireworks could be traumatizing. But before the big show, I took the dog out to relieve herself in the backyard. There was still at least an hour of daylight, but the entire neighborhood was pretty quiet because most everyone was at the fairgrounds or various other holiday events. So when an unfamiliar large white pickup drove slowly down the street, I definitely noticed it. It must have turned around at the end of the street because I saw it again moving in the opposite direction, only about 20 seconds later. This time, it turned into the parking lot of the road department. Now, people have been known to toss things in the empty garbage trucks, usually at night to avoid getting caught, because they don't want to or are unable to make the trip to the landfill themselves. Usually it's things like, furniture or broken equipment, but I didn't see any of these things in the back of this truck. The driver was a somewhat stocky guy of average height. He took 3 large black trash bags from the bed of his truck and tossed them one by one into the hopper of the garbage truck. Then he left. Now, I swear that I'm not one of those meddling rear window types who always thinks activity is suspicious and that their neighbors are up to no good. But something about this didn't sit right with me. Normally, when I see people tossing their garbage into the trucks and leaving, I don't bother reporting it because it's relatively harmless. But this time, I don't know, I had a gut feeling. So I called the cops. If anything, they could get the guy for illegally dumping trash from a barbecue or whatever. While I'm on the phone, though, with dispatch, I put my dog inside to cut down on distractions while the officers investigate. A few minutes later, an officer arrived and I crossed the street to meet him, gave him a description of the events and pointed out which of the trucks the man had tossed his bags. He found the bags, he took photos, he put on gloves and told me to stay back. The bags were tied in a knot at the top, and it took him a minute to untie one because of the gloves and how tight the knot was, but eventually he got it open, looked inside for a few seconds, then twisted it closed and took a few steps back. "Oh no," he said under his breath. "What is it?" I asked. It's a body." I felt sick. I could tell that he felt sick too. I saw him grow pale, his hand was trembling when he held the radio, even his voice was shaking as he gave the code to dispatch. The dispatcher sounded confused when she asked him to repeat it, and within 10 minutes, the county sheriff was on the scene. Even he looked sick at the contents of the bag. But the coroner arrived about 10 minutes after that, and the first officer walked me back to the house, along with another one who arrived at the same time as the coroner. Though I showed the first cop via the app on my phone when I described the events initially, I now showed them the video on a larger screen. The camera caught footage of the truck as it drove by both times, as well as pulling into the parking lot, though unfortunately not a clear view of the license plate or of the man tossing the bags out of frame. We watched the footage over and over, pausing frames and trying to get different angles, the officers taking notes. Ultimately, they requested this footage as well as a copy of the files from the past week to see if the truck had been in the area before. I've also been saving footage until the road department installs their own camera this week, so that was useful. Because this is all still so fresh though, I don't know any more details. What I do know is that everything was in pieces, but I don't know the age of the victim, the gender, the cause of death, any of that. Information hasn't been released to the public either. I don't know if the coroner has even been able to identify the body yet, to be honest. A police cruiser has been parked at the fire department next door for constant surveillance in case the guy comes back as well. And the guy who dumped the body is apparently likely a local. Which makes sense because how else would he know to dump them there, right? He probably thought that it would get buried in other people's illegal trash accumulated over the holiday weekend and the sanitation crew wouldn't have bothered to investigate. But when I think about how this guy lives in my community, it makes me feel physically ill. To think that he'd clearly scouted the area for a dump site, that it may not have been the first time that this had happened, that this could happen again. If I hadn't have called it in, if I hadn't have been in the backyard at that exact moment, or if I'd ignored that gut feeling, the victim would never have even been found. May never have found potential justice. Their loved ones may never even have closure. In fact, there's a possibility that it just might happen again to another poor soul. I hope that it's just not me. Please don't let it be me. In fact, I think that it's time that I moved again. Third time's a charm, right? So, to put this into context, I'm a 20-year-old girl. I live in the suburbs in a small residence of 6 houses, and my gate is almost always broken, including today. That means like 80% of the time, it's wide open, so everyone can fit into the small courtyard. My house has 1 floor. There are 4 bedrooms, including mine, and downstairs there's a guest bedroom, which is used as a sort of treatment room because I have big health concerns. This is where all the equipment and the medicines are stored, and this is also where the care takes place. Also, I have a dog. I'm very, very close to him. He's a little bit of all my life, to be honest. He feels everything to the point of feeling my epileptic seizures before they happen, to recognizing the nurses who are arriving. He recognizes by the sound of their tires when they arrive in the yard. He never barks to, except when there's a problem. And finally, a nurse spends like 4 to 5 times a day to give me care at my home, including infusions. This is important for the story. So that morning, like every morning, my liberal nurse arrived at 8 a.m. But for the rest of the story, I'll call her Sandra as well. She takes care of me as usual. That is to say, an infusion of a painkiller. She replaces the antibiotic diffusers. She takes a blood test and remakes the cassette on my morphine pump. We usually chat about everything and nothing, really. She tells me stories with patients during the treatment. My nurses are an integral part of my life. They've looked after me for 6 years now. She leaves after 40 minutes and says to me, "See you later. I think I'm going to be a little bit late today, but don't worry." That day, I have a medical appointment in the morning, and I'm alone all day because my parents are working, except the nurse's passages every 4 hours. Once back from my meeting, I sit on the sofa with my dog while waiting for my nurse. After a while, I hear the tire noises. I get up because I think it's the nurse. But this time, my dog started growling behind the door. I look at the time, 11:50 a.m. I tell myself that it's a bit early, but sometimes instead of going after, my nurse exchanges me with the patient from before. So I didn't think too much of it. I hear knocking. I'm surprised. I go to open it. Usually the nurses just come in like that. And I see a young woman standing there who I've never seen. She says to me, "Hello, are you..." my name. "I'm Camille, a third-year nursing student. Your nurse will be a little bit late, so she told me to come and start preparing, and she'll arrive soon." I'm not too concerned. I'm used to students coming, to be honest, but I'm just a little bit surprised that Sandra didn't warn me, because usually she warns me in the morning or sends me a message or something. And even then, she never leaves a student alone when it's the first time that we've seen each other. I tell myself that she must have forgotten to tell me. I bring her in and show her the way to the treatment room. I take out the things for treatment while she washes her hands, and my dog is just really weird. He growls at her as soon as she approaches me, and turns to come around me. I was embarrassed, so I left him in the living room and closed the door to be quiet. I don't really care what she does. I let her do it. I'm on my phone at the moment anyway. She begins to put the IV on the infusion stand and takes a syringe. Normally we rinse my central catheter with a syringe of fire serum already made. You just have to open the packaging. And there I see that it's not a pre-made syringe, but a syringe that she has prepared. I look up and see all of the stuff on my treatments are intact and haven't been opened. Yet I did hear the sound of something breaking. I'm starting to think that this is weird, and there she starts to approach me to inject the syringe when I get a message from my nurse. "I'll be there in 5 minutes. Can you start pulling out the material?" And man, did my blood run cold. I got up and said, I'm just going to the toilet. I'm sorry." I ran and locked myself in the downstairs toilet. The whole time my dog was barking and growling and carrying on, and when I opened the door, he followed me straight up so that we were both in the toilet. I sent a message to my nurse that there was another student nurse here, don't worry, and she replied with, "Who?" It was at this point that I started crying in the toilet and was really, really scared. This woman came up to me and said, "Is everything okay?" I think that she could see that I was staying a long time in there. And I said, yeah, I'll be right out." Then I heard my front door slam. 2 minutes later, I hear it reopen, but this time I hear my nurse. I came out of the toilet crying, and she asked me what happened. I told her about it and showed the treatment room, and so we called the police. They came, they examined, took samples, the syringe, and the rest of whatever this woman had prepared. The test results were received a few days after receiving the products in the syringe and the infusion. And in the syringe was a paralyzer. She had put a dose that could have paralyzed a man of 120 kilos apparently, and I'm only 40. And in the IV, it was a medicine to lower the heart rate, but it was so concentrated that it could have stopped anyone's heart. Today, we still have no idea who this person was, and luckily, I never heard from her again. I want to specify too that she stole all of my opioids, but no other things like my tablet, which was on the bed of my computer, which was in the living room. In retrospect, I realize that my dog sensed that this person didn't mean me well, and I tell myself that I should have watched her because she was just a student and that my treatments are not paracetamol and all that. And I keep wondering what could have happened if I hadn't looked at my phone that day. I will give you guys the news as soon as I have it, and if you have any questions, then don't hesitate to ask. Thanks for listening as well. It was a scary ordeal and something that I'll never forget, but anyway, I hope you guys have a nice day. So, this story happened to me sometime in 2014. I've never told anyone about it. You'll see why in a minute. But I thought that you guys might find it interesting. I'm almost 30 now, and thinking about it still keeps me awake at night sometimes. But keep in mind, I never did drugs, I don't drink alcohol, or anything like that. So each summer, my family and I would visit my granddad's house, where he, my uncle, and 2 aunts live. My uncle is a self-proclaimed treasure hunter. In North Africa, these hunter people would supposedly employ demons through some creepy rituals as well to guide them to hidden old valuables buried in some secret places. I know, weird. My uncle is pretty knowledgeable about demons and jinns though because of this. And one night, after having a big North African dinner with the family, I hung around with my uncle in his room. I just always liked to listen to his creepy stories. He decided to show me, though, that night, a stack of old Islamic witchcraft books and manuscripts. Among them was one called The Great Secret to Attract the Beloved, a rough translation from Arabic. The book was a bit hard to read as it was old and handwritten. I browsed randomly, and it was some sort of a talisman with instructions. You had to draw some sort of a table, and within the columns you draw some letters or something. You then take the paper and put it under your pillow, and this supposedly will bring you a lover. Seemed silly to me, but fun to try, so I thought, why not? So eventually I slept, and I woke up sometime in the early morning. I still remember it too, as it was a little bit bright and the pigeons would get really loud at that time as well. But their sound was not actually what woke me up. It was actually the weight of a woman on my waist. I got woken up by a lady. Well, you can guess what she was doing. And there was no pleasure, but all I felt was just terror. The lady had no face. It was darker than the room. Abyss kind of dark. She had like glowing neon red hair that burnt me as well whenever she'd bounce, and like every good Muslim guy, I looked away and started reciting verses of the Quran, and I looked back at her and she was just gone. But my pants were down and I was immediately lost in thought. The next day, my uncle saw me acting sort of weird and distant and asked me why. I hesitated a lot, but eventually I told him about it. Not sure if he was joking, but the dude told me that it's just his ginger familiar. She likes to play with young guys. I kid you not, that's exactly what he said too. And I have not spent a night there since then. Fast forward 3 days later though, back in our room, I was asleep and I have this dream. I'm walking in a dark tunnel, I get shivers, and I reach to my pocket and find my phone, and just as I turn my flashlight on, it revealed a naked black man kneeling. I approached him and touched his shoulder, and he stood up. He kept standing up, and he was really tall. He smiled at me with huge white teeth, and I woke up from the dream unable to move. I guess it was some sort of sleep paralysis or something. Anyways, I was unable to move, and I start looking around with my eyes, and a figure stands up from the edge of my bed. And it was the same dude from my dream. He stood there for a moment and looked at me. I tried to scream, but nothing came out of my throat, and then he just vanished in a cloud of like really dark smoke, darker than the dark of the room. He turned to smoke and then appeared right to the side of my bed. He stood there again, tall and completely naked. His face slowly got closer to mine, and just as I made eye contact with him, he smiled at me and vanished in smoke. I could finally move. I stood up and just sort of breathed for a moment. Went to drink some water, unable to believe what had just happened. The next day, I get woken up at 8 in the morning by my alarm. With my eyes half closed, I try to reach for the phone to shut it down, but I get blocked by something. I thought that it was my brother, but when I looked, my hand was blocked by what I can only describe as like a midget's hand. A midget who had the face of the brother of one of my friends. He then laughed at me and ran away towards the door with his short legs, and I know it sounds kind of comical, but man, when you go through this stuff, it is freaky. Since then, I started praying, and I've not seen any of them again. I like to think that they were just sleep paralysis episodes, but to be honest, I'm not so sure. My partner and I are avid hikers. Last July, we went on a trip and decided to camp at this spot that we love. It's quiet, off the beaten path, and offers absolutely spectacular views of portions of George Washington National Forest to the west. And the first day and evening of the trip itself was really nice and uneventful, though we didn't sleep super well because of the humidity. The next morning, though, we decided to go for a hike in a portion of Jefferson Forest. We'd never been there before. It's comprised of ATV trails and about a dozen campsites, but has a trail that leads to an old fire tower that we'd always wanted to check out. It was about a 45-minute drive from our campsite, mostly on back roads. When we got there, the first thing that struck out to us was how empty the campsites were. But we actually didn't camp there the night before because we'd heard that the site is usually packed, and we knew that we wouldn't arrive early enough in the weekend to get a spot. There were only 2 spots taken though. In one was a sort of desiccated tent and a bunch of garbage. It looked like someone had been there for a while, but it was deserted when we arrived. In the other, there was a young woman, I'm guessing in her late teens, setting up a small backpacking tent. There was a truck and one other smaller car in the parking area, and that was it. We parked and started getting our gear together, and the woman approaches us to ask if we knew where the trailhead was. I told her that we'd read that it branched off about 100 yards into one of the ATV tracks, but we weren't 100% sure which. Since I was getting such weird vibes from the place, I kind of hoped that she'd stick around and go with us to find it, but she just thanked us and took off in the general direction of the trail. We set off and walked up and down a few of the ATV trails until we found the walking path. We saw 2 ATVs shoot by us at one point, but otherwise didn't encounter another soul, including the woman from earlier. It took us about an hour, I would guess, to get to the top of the mountain where the fire tower was. It's an old metal structure, and you have to climb to a narrow set of stairs to get to the top of it. We got up, looked around, took some pictures, and started heading down. Honestly, the view was kind of a letdown, but about halfway down, very suddenly, everything just sort of stopped. The birds, the bugs, everything, even the wind. It was just dead silent. I don't know how quite to put it into words, but it felt like the ancientness of the forest was contorting and sort of crushing us. I felt trapped all of a sudden and cornered in spite of the expanse around us. My partner and I looked at each other and wordlessly started to book it out of there. We started running back to the car, but the feeling only followed us, and as we were rounding one of the switchbacks, we heard this unearthly shriek, like a cross between metal on metal and a choir singing off key. And we also saw something. I just got a glimpse of it before we blacked out, but I don't know how to describe it other than it looked huge, despite clearly not taking up much physical space, and moved in sort of writhes and flashes. It didn't have a color, it just felt like evil and emptiness. I probably only perceived it for like half a second before my memory just completely gives way. When we came to, we were sitting in the car and 2 whole hours had passed. Double the length of time it took us to get up there. I don't know if we lost consciousness or just somehow blocked those hours out. I learned later the exact same thing had happened to my partner as well. Both of the cars were next to us in the parking lot, and there were still just the 2 tents at the campsite. The woman wasn't in hers, and it looked exactly the same way as she'd left it. I think about her all the time and have spent a ton of time trying to figure out if someone went missing around the time of our trip. It took a few months for my partner and I to even talk about that day, and some of the stories that I've shared here have made me feel less alone. It was a scary ordeal, and I still don't have answers. We still love to hike, but honestly, I haven't been able to go into the Appalachian forest since this happened. I'm curious if others have had other experiences like this, because it's a real head-scratcher, that's for sure. I've been running in these woods for, well, as long as I can really remember, but this might make me change my mind. So the story began at around 6:30 p.m. I had finished eating and decided to go on a run as usual. I always use the same path, across the street, run for about 1 kilometer and past the gate that goes into the woods. Something important to note too is that the trail that I use in the forest is separated about halfway through. One path is paved and the other isn't. I usually go onto the unpaved path first and then turn onto the paved one after about 3 kilometers. Nothing ever really goes wrong. I meet some rare people walking their dogs occasionally, but other than that, I'm pretty much alone. At least, I thought that I was. You see, I'd been running for a while now when I heard a notification coming from my phone. An airdrop notification. Since I didn't want to make it look like I was worried, I kept running for a couple of minutes and then stopped to change the music. I opened the airdrop dreadfully. I mean, who the heck was sending me stuff here? I was pretty sure that I was alone. I clicked on the drop and my heart sank. It was a Snapchat picture of me running with the caption, "You look good." I didn't turn around. Instead, I just kept running like nothing happened until I reached a certain point. You see, the forest is surrounded by a fence to stop children from coming in unsupervised, and I didn't like that rule when I was little, so my friends and I actually cut a hole in it. When I was aligned with that hole, I quickly turned and buried myself into the forest, aiming for my escape. And as soon as I did this, I could hear ruffling behind me. I still didn't turn back though, and when I finally reached the hole, I jumped through it and absolutely booked it to the fire station that was a couple of streets down. The last things that I could hear when leaving the forest was an angry huff and metal meeting metal. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I have never run in that forest ever again. In the 14th century, the plague arrived here and with a vengeance sought to kill everyone in sight. A few managed to escape to a decent large island in one of our biggest lakes in my country, but the plague wiped them all out, one after the other. In the end, the whole island turned into basically a large cemetery, or so I've heard. Another thing too is that an author lived here in the 50s before moving to another one. The house and adjoined shed still stand. And if you have the patience to listen to me, then I can promise you that it's pretty terrifying what I'm about to tell you. So I love the outdoors, and after coming across this island on Wikipedia, I just needed to go. And then the opportunity arose. My family and I found a road close by and followed a small path to a little peninsula. The island measured at the very least half a mile long, I would guess, and was truly a sight to behold. It might not seem that big, but it's heavily forested and covered by cliffs and large hills, and it's larger than you might think when you set foot on there. Well, I swam over there and took about 5 minutes, and that was around 100 or 200 yards. The water was not warm, but perfectly cool enough to shield me from the blistering heat that day. Not too challenging too, and I was in a very good mood, to say the least. Immediately though, I didn't find a path, and that's why I just walked until I found one. After coming across a little shelter, I continued to walk. And as I was taken away by its enchanting beauty, crisp blue water which almost looked like a lagoon, 100 feet high cliffs on a small island in northern Europe, the truth is that it seemed so incredibly amazing, just too good to be true. My journey continued though, and I went on. After finding the lagoon-looking thing and being both bewildered and amazed, I continued, and man, do I still regret that so very much. The thing that I recall the most too was that after I passed a little meadow, my mind immediately thought, and I don't know why, this will take a dark turn. And maybe I just kind of made myself think that it was different, but it just feels like this cozy and wonderful atmosphere just sort of changed all of a sudden. And it all just seemed different after that. Well, you know how I mentioned the author's house? Yeah, abandoned since the 50s. I saw it, but before I could reach those forgotten and sad-looking old buildings, I needed to cross some ferns. They didn't look odd or anything like that. It just looked like a path between some patches of waist-high ferns, and that was about it. But it was at this point that, for every other step that I took, I heard movement from the ferns. I sort of stopped, looked around, didn't see anything. I figured that it was just a rabbit or something. Took some more steps, and then the movement and snaps of twigs got closer and closer. Whatever this thing was, it was following me. Trying to shut out my increasing feeling of unease, I went up to see this old house. Coming closer, I saw just how terrible it looked. The main house and the surrounding sheds looked beautiful, but long forgotten and neglected. The lake, looking at me from behind the house, was a bit of a relief. But then, I heard voices. People were talking from inside or behind the house. Now, I was seriously horrified and got a feeling of dread that I'd never felt before. I just wanted to jump into the lake and take an extra long route back so that I wouldn't have to be there anymore. But whoever or whatever it was that talked, I never want to meet them, ever. So I did the only thing that I could. I ran, past the ferns, still hearing it following me, but after some very uncomfortable pacing, I finally crossed over the meadow and I felt better. In the end, I managed to swim back, but not until I came back to the shore from where I arrived, I had that feeling that someone or something was following me all that way. I still don't know what it was there on that island. It was very beautiful, but I don't think that I'm ever going to go back there after all of that. So this story happened just a few years back when I was visiting an old friend in Cologne, while at the same time taking advantage of him as a free stay for a meeting with my LARP group. For those who don't know what a LARP is, it's basically real-life role-playing. Imagine a D&D game, but instead of people sitting around a table with dice, you have people actually dressed up as their characters actually role-playing in real life. LARPing, it was my hobby since I was 14, and after I got a job that paid pretty well, I started to go a bit more all-out when it came to stuff for my hobby. One of those things I spent a solid amount of money on was my character's armor, which is important for this story. It was the chainmail that I wear under my outer armor. So, after the meeting of my group, I got mostly out of my LARP outfit because I really didn't want to walk around in it. The place where I was is one of the more dangerous places in the city, I guess you could say, as a medieval knight especially. But since I couldn't fit all in my bag, I kept my chainmail on as well as my tunic and pants. On my bus ride home, I noticed some guy seemed to have his eye on me. But I guessed it was because I still looked very out of place in all of the stuff that I was wearing. When he got off on the same station as me, I didn't really pay much attention to it. I was almost at my friend's place too and decided to call him, asking if we should meet and get something to eat, which he agreed to before I even ended my question. I arrived at our meeting spot first and I waited. But then I noticed that the guy from the bus, he was there again, and he now walked straight towards me. I got closer to the wall to make space, but he didn't pass me. He stopped before me and pulled a knife on me, demanding my bag, wallet, and phone. I was willing to give him my wallet, but tried to explain to him that the bag only had some armor and foam weapons, but it seems that even just talking was enough to set this guy off, and suddenly I felt two fast, stinging punches into my stomach. And man, did it hurt. I dropped down and the guy grabbed my bag, and honestly, the next things are not really in my mind. What I mean is that I was barely able to notice anything other than the voice in my head screaming, "You got stabbed." So the next thing I noticed was my friend shaking me. My bag was open and all my stuff was just all over the place. He was holding my helmet with blood on it. As he said, he saw the guy throwing my stuff around after the bag was most likely too heavy and big for him. So my friend, seeing me on the floor, managed to grab the first thing that he could, which was the helmet, and hit the guy with it until he ran. We later checked my stomach, and even though I had two giant deep blue bruises, which, man did they hurt, I only had small cuts since the chainmail, thankfully, stopped the knife from going through. Until this day, I still get sick in my stomach when I think back on that day, and remember that if I had not worn a piece of my LARP clothing that day, I would likely be dead, literally killed over a bag full of costumes, 150 pounds in my wallet, and a 10-year-old phone. Man, this world is a messed up place. I was the store manager of a nationwide mall computer later gaming store. This was long before GameStop and cell phones and all that. We were located on the left side facing the middle of the mall with JC Penney's to the left at that end. This detail too is pretty important because it plays into what happened. So my ex-wife is a strikingly beautiful Latina woman. She was only 20 and my daughter 1.5 at the time. Unfortunately, but fortunately for us obviously, we had very beautiful babies. They almost look like dolls, to be honest, and the reason I say this is because my daughter attracted way too much attention as a baby. We stopped going out in public because people were constantly approaching us and trying to touch her. Anyway, it's a Sunday and I would work the whole day since it was a short day. The three of us would go to work. My ex-wife would dress our daughter and herself up and make a day of it. She liked to shop and wander for the day, coming back to have lunch and stuff. Being the manager, I took long breaks as well. Everything is going along fine too, like any other Sunday. At some point, I go out to give her some money and my Spidey street senses start going crazy. I look to the left and see a man intently looking at my wife and our daughter. I meet his gaze and he doesn't look away. We had a huge wedding with like 200 plus guests and I asked my wife if she knew the person staring at her. We both look up and he was gone. It couldn't have been 2 or 3 seconds since I last looked at the guy as well. There was something strange about this guy though. I remember that to this day. He was dressed in a sort of dark grey suit with a dark grey overcoat. Not to trouble her though, I told her not to worry about it. We had lunch and we took the long way back to the store. We stopped by mall security. I introduced her to the security guys who had become good buddies of mine. I pulled them aside and told them what had happened. They were concerned and we stopped by the info booth and I tell the person working there to let me know if she sees him. Now, my ex-wife loves to shop at JC Penney's and go shopping in that store all the time. But before she goes in, I tell her about the man in the grey suit. She let me know that she'll keep an eye out for him and there's a call on the store phone. An employee tells me that it's the phone and I'm like, yeah, I heard it ring. He tells me that he needs some help and he pulls me inside and says, it's your wife and she sounds really scared. I quickly jump on the phone. She tells me that the man that I described has been following her for like over half an hour. And when he had first showed up, she said that he was reaching out for our daughter. I immediately called security. They come up the middle with my employee standing watch on the entrance to the JC Penney's. I go out the back into the parking garage, which was no more than like 50 feet away. And there's only 2 entrances into the store, front and back. There's lots of emergency exits on the parking garage side, so the only entrance not covered was, well, really the front. Luck would have it, a police officer had pulled someone over from the street and was in the front parking lot. By this point, I don't want the gentleman to go away, to be honest. I want him caught. Everyone starts converging on the store. He's got nowhere to go, right? They walk to the station where my wife is surrounded by the store manager, several employees, and they have our daughter behind the counter. The police officer had been alerted, and mall security escorts both of them out of the store to me. We put them in our car, and they drive straight back to her mother's. They continue to search the store, every nook and cranny as well, but he was just never found. To this day, I can remember every detail about that guy though. But the detail that sticks with me the most, his eyes, man, they were just black, like coal. So I'm male, 31, and from an eastern terrible part of Europe. This happened while I was working as a security guard in 2014. But 1 or 2 months, I can't remember exactly the date. It was cold and icy, but not snowing. I was working on facilities for sewage water treatment. It was big, roughly the size of a football stadium, and it was on the edge of that city with the first house about maybe a kilometer distance away. and the facility was on the end of a small road. It was around where some wooded areas were and farm-like places of land, and behind that there was a large river. So my shift was from 4 p.m. to 8 a.m., 16 hours. 4 p.m. is when last workers get out, and you're all alone until like the end of the shift pretty much. To make things worse, there was makeshift guardhouses that were basically old containers with doors and one window, a few chairs, a table, an old TV, and that was about it. And my job was to walk around the perimeter every 1 to 2 hours. Funny thing too, as well, is that it was a large and state-of-the-art facility with like one guy guarding it without a gun or any kind of protection. Anyway, fast forward to around 1 or 2 a.m, I'm sitting in the guardhouse watching some terrible movie when I heard some noises like something had fell on the ground. My first thought was that maybe cats had knocked something off, since other security guards that worked there fed some strays from time to time, so they came back pretty often. So I put my jacket on and I went outside to check. Oh, something I forgot to mention too was a sound of machines that were there. It wasn't loud enough to damage your ears, but it was pretty loud and it filled the air outside and pretty much all around. Anyway, like I said, I went outside and circled around behind the guardhouse in the direction of the thuds that I heard. A few seconds later, from that direction, I heard an incredible scream, so strong that it deafened the sounds of all the machines that were there. When I tell this to people as well, I can't explain just how strong and long that scream was. I was completely paralyzed for some short time. I couldn't make any part of my body move. But when I got to my senses, though, I just turned around and went back into the guardhouse, stood in there some time. But the scream came from right outside of the entrance, and it was behind the metal fence as far as I could understand. When I collected myself, I put my mobile phone on recording in my front jacket pocket and took some metal bar that I found inside, opened the gate and went behind the fence 20 or 30 meters into the darkness because I wanted it to happen again so that I would have proof. But nothing happened and I went back and locked myself in the guardhouse. The next hour passed and I realized all that time that I must have been in shock or something. I was confused, just had a really strange feeling like something happened to me, but I wasn't yet aware of what exactly happened. In the direction where that scream came from is a sort of long meadow and some trees and river. Nothing else really. I call it a scream because I don't really know what else to call it, to be honest. It wasn't a typical scream, mind you. It was high, but not excessively high, I guess, but it was strong, man, and I felt like it just pierced me. A few days after that, I started to retain a little bit of the memory of that exact moment. And I can't explain or see the full picture, but I think there was something white in the distance. That's all I remember what I saw, but the sound is something that will stay with me forever. We don't have mountain lions or cougars or anything like that where I live. Two animals that can scream are foxes and pheasants. I've spent many hours listening to them and I couldn't find anything similar. But both animal noises are much shorter and weaker and the pitch was way off, and all in all, after that, I felt confused, like I might still be missing some memory due to shock or something, and can't really remember much. Just some white thing and that horrible noise. I would like to get your thoughts though on what you guys think may have happened here, because I am just lost and have no idea. Years ago, I worked at a local casino. A lot of the customers could be kind of weird, but this one guy in particular who spent the evening flirting with me seemed alright. So I agreed to go on a date with him that upcoming weekend. We met earlier on a Saturday at his friend's house for a casual barbecue. Everyone seemed nice, the food was decent, but I did notice my date taking an obscene amount of Jell-O shots. Later, we all agreed to go to a bar and hang out. My first red flag should have been the fact that my date tried to force French me and stuck his tongue down my throat. Stupid me blamed the alcohol. I know, but I was young, insecure, and just didn't read the situation well at the time. But I get to a local bar and all was okay until they invited me to another party that would take place a few days later. I had other plans, so I politely declined. And my date's mood immediately changed at that too, and he became very hostile and angry. Within seconds, he began yelling at me, accusing me of things, and I was completely baffled. He kept screaming and becoming more violent and went on and on about how inappropriate it was for me to decline the invite and how I was just trying to mess with other guys. At that point, I started to freak out and I decided to leave. He followed me out into the parking lot where he proceeded to yell more obscenities. I told him that I was not going to talk to him anymore and tried to get into my car. And then things got worse. He suddenly grabbed me by my shoulders and shoved me into the side of my car. Then he took one hand and grabbed me by my neck while still yelling at me. He attempted to choke me while calling me a whole mess of more bad words. I screamed and told him that he was hurting me and that I would call the cops if he immediately didn't let me go. I was actually amazed too that he backed off at this point. I jumped into my car and drove away as fast as I could, and I can easily say that I was never more frightened in my life. The next day at work, I immediately went to our security offices, which were run by state troopers, and reported the assault to the officers. Since the guy was a regular visitor of the casino, I was not taking chances of running into him again. And they pulled up his long criminal record, and lo and behold, charge after charge for assault, stalking, and even kidnapping. I completely flipped out. They put him on a blacklist though, and when he showed up at the casino a few days later, he was arrested and forbidden to ever come there again. Unfortunately though, a few days later, I found out from one of my female co-workers that they knew he was kind of crazy and had a history but didn't want to tell me because I was the new girl and would figure it out for myself. I was livid and felt totally betrayed by that. And not only that, but I was paranoid that he would come after me because I had him banned from the premises. He was constantly calling and texting and left threatening voicemails on my phone that lasted almost a year, mind you. And it gets worse. Less than 2 weeks after all of this, another girl that I worked with ended up getting kidnapped by another regular. She was not so lucky and was held hostage for like 3 days in this dude's basement. He'd been coaxing her and gaining her trust for 2 whole years as well. Luckily, she was found and she recovered well. But as soon as I found out, I quit on the spot and I just walked out. I've never been back and I will never set foot into another casino for as long as I live. So the quick backstory to this is that it was about 2013 to 2014, and I'm living in San Jose, California. I'm a bit of a weed smoker, and this was before recreational cannabis passed, so I and my friend were downtown going to one of the cheaper places to get some. Nothing was remarkable. The day was fine and completely unmemorable, to be honest, aside from what happens next. So upon walking to my car with my friend from the clinic, a woman rushes to us and frantically begins pleading for help. She claims a small group of men tried to rob her for her purse, and she claimed that she just escaped. But also is fearful that they're looking for her or something. She begged for a ride in the end, and my friend implored me to help, and the woman was by herself in broad daylight. She didn't seem to be a threat. Now, at that moment, I'm caught by her little story, and with the sort of rush of the situation, I quickly give her the benefit of the doubt, I suppose. I simply let her in the car and decide to drive off. On the drive, my friend is making small talk with her, and I then start more actively assessing the situation. This woman is suddenly calm as a cucumber and pleasantly engaging in small talk. Something seems off. I bring up the notion of informing the police. After all, it is broad daylight, and if there is ever a chance to catch them, it would be right then. She is safe in my moving car, but no. She shrugs off the notion with a degree of passivity that is quite striking. There were no anxious words, not even understandable fears of police involvement, just this indifference to the question. It's clear that she would continue to ignore the topic in favor of more small talk too, so I just drop it. She's in a good mood. She's far from withdrawn. She's talking about all sorts of random stuff with a smile, like the vibes of any common sociable person on a pleasant day. We decide then that we'll drop her off at her home and she'll reward me with some weed. I didn't really need the weed, but she said that she had it on her already and wanted to reward me for the help, and she insists. I start remembering the moment that she ran into us though. She must not have been running for more than 15 seconds because she never had to catch her breath in the slightest. I'm no fitness expert by any means, but I've worked out my fair hours and taken some martial arts too, and it doesn't take a doctor to know when someone is in fear for their safety and running for their life, right? There's a heavy demand that gets put on the body. I may as well have just picked her up from a leisurely stroll though, the way she was acting. It's worth noting too that she looked nearly middle-aged, I suppose, and not in the best of health. She didn't look in terrible health either, though. Anyway, out of nowhere, she rolls down my window and lights up a cigarette. Now, I actually smoke cigarettes too, but it is the most basic respect to ask before you light up in a car, right? I wasn't even smoking one myself in the car at this point. I tell her that I did not give her permission to smoke in the car, and she says, "It's okay, I'll lash out the window." What the heck, right? I tell her clearly to put it out now, and she then just quietly and shamelessly refuses. In my mind, I just say, screw it. Something is up with her, and I just wanted to get out where she has to be and move on with my day. I'm listening to some random pop station on my car radio. The woman now gleefully proclaims loudly, "Oh, I love this song." She proceeds to awkwardly move up from the back seat right in between me and my friend and tries to raise the volume. I move her hand away politely and tell her that the volume was loud enough. She doesn't accept my volume and proceeds to attempt to wrestle me to raise the volume. This woman is far from anything resembling hysterical, and I need to emphasize how calm she is, trying to wrestle the driver of a moving vehicle simply to listen to loud pop music. It is some really odd stuff, and I'm driving on terrible roads of downtown San Jose at this point still, and the roads here get legit dangerous to even Focus drivers. But I move my hand away to see how far she'll put it and assume she'll stop at some point. But she raises the volume to a ridiculously painful volume and just sits back down. So I then cut the volume, take off the faceplate of the radio and throw it to the side, and I tell her no more music then. She calmly continues small talk as if nothing at all happened. One question might be, of course, if she was some sort of a psychiatric condition affecting her ability with social interaction or something like that. I truly doubt that though. This woman was actually quite charismatic and not in any way awkward, despite the cigarette and radio behavior up to this point in the story anyway. She was actually pretty remarkably pleasant to talk to. She was a social butterfly, I would say. She picked up on standard social cues without a doubt. And another question is, was she psychotic? Funnily enough, I actually have a psychotic condition myself, bipolar 1 with psychosis. Psychosis is some really heavy stuff, and it is an extremely dissociative experience. And when you are truly psychotic, it is incredibly difficult to hide entirely. And this woman demonstrated that she had the general grasp of reality typical of someone absent of clinical psychosis. And the obvious other question was if she was on drugs. I actually have had known heavy drug abusers in my life. You name it, I've seen it pretty much. 2 people close to me were unable to battle their addiction to the point that it tragically took their lives as well. But anyway, I've done my best to express how strikingly normal she expressed herself. She exhibited no identifiable sign of an intoxicated person. The cigarette thing and the radio madness came across as extremely inconsiderate, but sober and even sociable at that. And trust me, I've grown far too familiar with what those signs of intoxication are at this point in my life, so it wasn't that either. We then approach, though, where she says her home is. She says that it's in an apartment complex on the street that we're driving down. I'm feeling glad that I can drop her off and rid myself of the feeling of creepiness lingering in me. But the next part is where I have my biggest questions. So instead of just waiting on that street, she adamantly requests that we pull into this shady little motel right next to the apartment complex. At this point, I'm wondering why she's requesting the motel when there is clearly room on the street. But I feel that I can get her out of the car if I just surrendered that much, so I pull in. The lot is small and the spaces are all full as much as I can tell. There's no place to park, and as I drive down the lot, I see a group of men standing in a circle talking to each other by a huge, nice truck. They're all pretty well dressed, not too formal, but certainly professional. One of them turns around to make eye contact with me as I drive past. He stares me down the entire time that I drive past the group, and the only way to make the exit at that point is to flip a U-turn at a spacious corner in the lot. Upon flipping it, I drive back where I was entering, and immediately notice that the truck is gone and all the men are no longer there either. It didn't take long at all to spin my car around, mind you. In fact, I made a deliberate effort to sort of slip around quickly. They literally all up and vanished, though, within the span of like a minute at the absolute most. They had to have booked it out of there with extreme urgency to have vanished just like that, and there were too many men for one truck. 7 to 10 people were in that original group at least. But then the woman said to park in the spot that the truck had just been at previously. She told me her weed was in her room and she would go and get it. This was actually different than her original story. She was clear about having it on her already before this point. To be honest though, at this point, I'm just trying to get her out and leave myself, so I tell her that it was fine. I insist that I don't need any compensation and she's free to just go to her home. She insists a few more times and I politely tell her that it's fine over and over again, and she gets more frustrated trying to get me to park in that damn spot. And eventually, she raises to a more aggressive tone and says, "You're stupid," and I reply, "No, I'm just trying to be nice." That was the last thing that she said as she walked out of the car too, as she left the cigarette butt in the car as well. Now, truthfully, I don't know for sure if she had any sinister plans for me and my friend. My mind tells me that the men may have tried to rob me of my car had I parked it, but I can't say for certain. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, I don't know, but all I know is that she behaved in a manner that felt really unsettling to me and really suspicious. I felt like I was quite respectful, despite all of the craziness that went on. My friend agreed too that it was an uncomfortable situation and that I did the right thing. Others have told me that it was a very questionable situation as well, but I don't know. What do you guys think?